The paradox in the acacia shadow. 3.2 million years ago, in what we now call the Afar Triangle of Ethiopia, a female Australopithecine made a choice that would echo through the ages. She was small, barely 3.5 feet tall, standing in the dappled shade of an acacia tree. Before her stood two males. One was massive, his shoulders broad, his canines long and sharp. The other was smaller, his frame less imposing, his jaw weaker. In every primate species on Earth, the female would choose the first male. Strength meant protection, size meant dominance, power meant survival for her offspring. But she chose the second male. And in that moment, a moment repeated thousands of times across the East African Rift Valley, the trajectory of human evolution shifted forever. This wasn't random. This wasn't an accident. This was a revolution in sexual selection that would transform a population of tree-dwelling apes into the most successful species the planet has ever known. Welcome to the story of how weakness became strength, how vulnerability became power, and how the most counterintuitive mating strategy in nature gave birth to humanity itself. Imagine the East African landscape 3.2 million years ago. Volcanic mountains rise in the distance, their peaks catching the first light of dawn. Golden grasslands stretch to the horizon, interrupted by scattered acacia trees casting long shadows across the savanna. The air shimmers with heat, and in the distance, a herd of ancient elephants moves slowly toward a water source. Charles Darwin understood sexual selection better than almost anyone in the 19th century. He saw how peacocks grew absurd tail feathers, how elk grew massive antlers, how male elephant seals grew to 5 times the size of females. Sexual selection, he argued, was nature's other great force, working alongside natural selection to shape life on Earth. The logic was simple. Males compete, females choose. The strongest males win access to females. Their genes spread. Weakness dies out. Except in one lineage, this didn't happen. Look at our closest living relatives, chimpanzees and bonobos. Male chimps are 50% heavier than females. Their canine teeth are weapons, sharp, elongated fangs designed for combat. When you examine a male chimp's skull, you're looking at a fighting machine. The sagittal crest, that ridge of bone running along the top of the skull, exists solely to anchor massive jaw muscles. These aren't tools for eating, they're tools for dominance. Now look at Australopithecus afarensis, Lucy's species. Something strange happened. Males were still larger than females, but the gap was closing. Their canines were shrinking. The massive fighting teeth of their ancestors were becoming smaller, less projecting, less weapon-like with each passing 100,000 years. Picture the skull of a male chimpanzee beside the skull of a male Australopithecine. The difference is stark. Where the chimp has long, dagger-like canines that project well beyond the other teeth, the Australopithecine's canines are reduced, almost modest. The tooth rows are different too. The chimps form a rectangle with prominent canines at the corners, while the Australopithecines curve into a parabola, the canines barely interrupting the arch. This is what paleontologists call the canine reduction paradox. In a world of leopards, hyenas, and saber-toothed cats, in a world where violence determined survival, Australopithecine males were becoming less equipped for fighting. evolution doesn't make mistakes like this. Natural selection doesn't favor weakness in a dangerous world unless that weakness is buying something far more valuable. The question that haunted researchers for decades was simple. What were they buying? In 1974, when Donald Johanson and Tom Gray found Lucy in the scorching heat of Hadar, Ethiopia, they knew immediately they'd found something special. 40% of a skeleton, an unprecedented haul for a hominin that ancient. But it was the debates that followed that revealed the deeper mystery. Lucy was small, just over 3 feet tall, weighing perhaps 60 pounds. But was she representative of her species, or was she just a small individual? The answer came as more fossils emerged from the Ethiopian highlands and Tanzanian rift valleys. Australopithecus afarensis males averaged about 4.5 feet tall and weighed around 90 pounds. Females averaged 3.5 feet and 60 pounds. The males were roughly 50% heavier, significant sexual dimorphism, but nothing like the extreme differences seen in gorillas or orangutans, where males are twice the size of females. Here's what that tells us. Australopithecine society was changing. In primate species with extreme size differences, you see extreme competition between males and harems controlled by dominant patriarchs. One male, many females. Violence decides everything. But moderate dimorphism, the kind we see in A. afarensis, suggests something different. It suggests a society in transition. Males still competed, but not with the winner-take-all brutality of their ancestors. Females still chose, but they were choosing based on different criteria. The fossil record gives us tantalizing clues. At the Hadar site, we found the first family, the remains of at least 13 individuals who died together, possibly in a flash flood. Among them, large males, small males, adult females, juveniles. They were traveling together, living together. This wasn't a harem group controlled by a single dominant male. This was something more complex, more cooperative, and cooperation requires a different kind of male. To understand why Australopithecine females would choose smaller, weaker males, we need to understand the world they inhabited. East Africa, between 4 and 2 million years ago, wasn't a paradise. It was a killing ground. The climate was in flux. The forests that had sheltered their ancestors were retreating, replaced by open woodlands and grasslands. This was the world of the Pliocene, cooler, drier, more seasonal than the epochs before. Resources were scattered, predictability was gone, and predators were everywhere. At Hadar, at Latoli, at Olduvai Gorge, everywhere we find Australopithecine fossils, we also find the remains of predators. Dinofelis, a saber-toothed cat that specialized in hunting primates. Meganterion, another saber-tooth, smaller but lightning fast. Giant hyenas with bone-crushing jaws. Leopards that hunted from above, dropping from acacia branches onto unsuspecting prey below. Picture the reconstruction of this predator guild. Dinofelis, with its shortened, powerful saber teeth designed for precision killing, crouches near a waterhole. A pack of giant hyenas, each one larger than a modern lion, patrol the grasslands. In the acacia trees above, a leopard watches, its spotted coat perfect camouflage among the dappled shadows. We know Australopithecines were prey because we've found their bones with predator tooth marks. We've found Australopithecine skulls with puncture wounds that perfectly match leopard canines. we've found juvenile remains in what were clearly predator dens. In this world, being a large, aggressive male had advantages. You could intimidate rivals. You could potentially defend against smaller predators. You could secure access to the best feeding spots. But you also had disadvantages. Large bodies require more calories, up to 30% more than smaller bodies. In a seasonally variable environment where food was unpredictable, that was a death sentence during lean times. Large, aggressive males also attracted attention. They were more visible to predators, more likely to take risks, more likely to die young in dominance fights with other males. And here's the critical factor. If you died before your offspring were weaned, before they could survive independently, your genes died with you. Your size, your strength, your magnificent canines meant nothing. Females who chose these males were gambling. Sometimes they won, often they lost. But females who chose smaller, less aggressive males, males who survived longer, who avoided fights, who stayed close to offspring, were making a different bet, a safer bet. In 1981, anthropologist Owen Lovejoy proposed a radical theory. He suggested that the key innovation in human evolution wasn't bigger brains or better tools. It was male provisioning, males bringing food to females and offspring. The logic went like this. Australopithecine females faced an energy crisis. Walking upright freed their hands but created a new problem. Their infants couldn't cling to fur during locomotion because body hair had been reduced for thermoregulation. This meant females had to carry infants manually, which limited their ability to forage efficiently. Meanwhile, the shift to open woodlands meant food was more scattered. A nursing female with an infant couldn't range as far or as fast as a male. She was constrained, vulnerable, energy depleted. Imagine a female australopithecine trying to forage with an infant on her hip. She moves slowly through the grassland, one arm supporting the baby, the other reaching for fruits and seeds. Every few minutes she must stop to adjust her grip. She cannot climb high into trees. She cannot run from predators with the same speed as an unburdened individual. She is at a fundamental disadvantage. Enter a new kind of male. Not the biggest or strongest, but the most reliable. A male who brought food back to the female, who stayed close, who invested in offspring that were probably his. This required something revolutionary, pair bonding. Not lifelong monogamy necessarily, but sustained partnerships between specific males and females. And pair bonding created a new selection pressure. Females began choosing males not for their ability to fight other males, but for their ability to provide and protect over the long term. Lovejoy's theory was controversial when proposed and remains debated today, but the fossil evidence supports at least part of it. The reduction in canine size is real. The decrease in sexual dimorphism is real. And both trends accelerated between 4 and 2 million years ago, precisely when we see Australopithecines expanding across Africa, succeeding in diverse habitats. Something changed in their mating system, something that made smaller, less aggressive males more successful than their larger, more aggressive cousins. But provisioning alone doesn't explain everything. After all, males in many species provision females. Wolves, foxes, certain birds of prey. Yet none of these species evolved human-like intelligence or cooperation. The Australopithecine story had another dimension: cognitive selection. Brain size in Australopithecus afarensis was roughly 400 to 500 cubic centimeters, larger than chimps, around 350 cc's, but nowhere near modern humans, 1,350 cc's. However, size isn't everything. What matters is what the brain is doing. Recent analysis of endocasts, fossil impressions of brain surfaces, suggests that Australopithecine brains were beginning to reorganize. The frontal regions, associated with planning and social cognition, were expanding relative to sensory areas. The temporal lobes, involved in memory and social information processing, showed modern-looking asymmetries. In other words, these weren't just bigger brains, they were different brains. Brains being selected for social intelligence, not just survival intelligence. And here's where the female choice element becomes critical. Smaller, less aggressive males couldn't rely on physical dominance. They had to succeed through different means. They had to read social situations, form alliances, remember who owed them favors, figure out where food would be tomorrow, not just where it was today. They had to be smart. Females who chose these males weren't just choosing providers, they were choosing problem solvers. Males who could navigate a complex social world, who could avoid conflicts rather than win them, who could plan ahead rather than simply react. And because intelligence is heritable, those females' offspring inherited not just their father's smaller size, but his cognitive abilities. Generation by generation, the link between reduced aggression and increased intelligence was forged. So we return to that female in the acacia shadow. The large male before her was impressive, certainly. His size spoke of good genes, of foraging success, of dominance. But she'd seen males like him before. She'd seen them fight over access to females. She'd seen them injured, killed by rivals or predators drawn to the commotion. She'd seen their offspring orphaned when they died in stupid territorial disputes. The smaller male was different. He'd been bringing her food for weeks, not much, but consistently. He'd stayed close when predators prowled at dusk. He'd shown patience with juveniles from previous matings. He wasn't impressive in the way the large male was impressive, but he was reliable. He was present. He was clever enough to survive. And so she chose him. It wasn't the choice her ancestors would have made. It wasn't the choice female chimps or gorillas or baboons would make. It was a new kind of choice, based on a new kind of value system. It was the choice that made us human. But this raises a deeper question. How did this happen? How did female preferences shift so dramatically that they began to favor traits that, by all traditional evolutionary logic, should have been eliminated? What mechanism allowed weakness to become the winning strategy? To answer that, we need to look at the social structures emerging in Australopithecine groups. We need to examine the evidence for cooperation, for pair bonding, for a revolutionary new social system that would eventually give rise to human culture itself. The coalition of the weak. The sun climbs higher over the Afar Depression, and a group of 15 Australopithecines moves through the woodland edge. They're a mixed assembly, 3 adult males, 5 adult females, and 7 juveniles of various ages. They're not a family in the modern sense, but they're not strangers either. They know each other, they remember each other, and most importantly, they need each other. This is where the revolution truly began. Not in individual mate choices, but in the social architecture that made those choices possible. Because here's the paradox within the paradox. Smaller, weaker males should have been eliminated by larger, stronger males. In chimp society, they would have been. In gorilla society, they wouldn't have stood a chance. So how did they survive long enough for females to choose them? The answer lies in something that would become humanity's signature trait: Cooperation among unrelated males. In most primate societies, males are rivals, period. Male chimps form coalitions, yes, but these are temporary and often break down when females come into estrus. Male gorillas are largely solitary outside their harems, and when they encounter each other, violence erupts. Male orangutans avoid each other entirely, maintaining territories through intimidation and the occasional brutal fight. The Australopithecine males were doing something different, something that appears almost nowhere else in the primate world. They were forming sustained alliances that crossed genetic lines and persisted over time. How do we know this? The evidence is indirect but compelling. First, there's the fossil assemblage at Hadar. Multiple adult males found together, suggesting they lived together. Then, there's the reduction in sexual dimorphism itself. When you see male body size decreasing relative to females across evolutionary time, you're watching the intensity of male-male competition decrease. Smaller males are surviving and reproducing in numbers that would be impossible in a winner-take-all dominance system. But the most telling evidence comes from what happened next in human evolution. By 2 million years ago, with Homo erectus, we see unmistakable evidence of cooperative hunting, food sharing, and long-distance travel in mixed-sex groups. Those behaviors didn't appear out of nowhere. They were built on foundations laid by the Australopithecines. The Australopithecine males were learning to work together, and that changed everything. Imagine a scenario that played out countless times in the Pliocene woodlands. A large, dominant male, let's call him Alpha, controls access to a particular fig tree heavy with ripe fruit. It's the dry season, and food is scarce. Alpha sits at the base of the tree, and when other Australopithecines approach, he displays aggressively. Lips pulled back, canines exposed, arms raised. The message is clear. This resource is mine. In a typical primate group, the story ends there. Other individuals wait their turn or move on to find food elsewhere. The strong eat first. The weak wait or starve. But watch what happens in this Australopithecine group. Two smaller males, we'll call them Beta and Gamma, approach together. Neither could challenge Alpha individually. Beta weighs perhaps 70 pounds to Alpha's 95. Gamma is even smaller, but together they're a different proposition. Alpha displays. Beta and Gamma don't retreat. Instead, they position themselves on opposite sides of the tree. Alpha charges toward Beta. Beta retreats a few steps, but Gamma immediately moves toward the tree from the opposite side. Alpha wheels around to face this new threat. Now Beta advances again. Alpha is caught in a dilemma. He can chase off one male, but not both simultaneously. And while he's focused on one, the other gains access to the food. After several minutes of this, Alpha's displays become less intense. Eventually, grudgingly, he allows both males to feed, not close to him, but in the outer branches of the tree. Beta and Gamma have won. Not through strength, but through coordination. This is coalition behavior, and it's absolutely critical to understanding how weaker males survived and eventually thrived. However, coordination requires something that doesn't come naturally to male primates: trust. And trust requires cognitive abilities that go far beyond simple survival intelligence. Beta and Gamma need to understand each other's intentions. When Gamma moves toward the tree, Beta needs to know that Gamma will actually follow through and not simply retreat at the first sign of aggression from Alpha. They need to be able to predict each other's behavior. They need a theory of mind, the ability to model what another individual is thinking and planning. This is where the reorganization of the Australopithecine brain becomes relevant. Those expanding frontal lobes weren't just getting bigger for no reason. They were being selected for social cognition, the ability to track relationships, to remember past interactions, to understand reciprocity. I help you today, you help me tomorrow. Modern primatologists have documented this kind of coalition behavior in chimps, but it's rare and often unstable. Chimp coalitions typically form between related males, brothers usually, and even then, they frequently break down. Unrelated male chimps cooperate only opportunistically and temporarily. But Australopithecine males were taking this to a new level. They were forming coalitions that persisted. That required trust. That required communication beyond simple threat displays and submission signals. We can't know exactly how they communicated. The fossil record doesn't preserve vocal anatomy in enough detail to reconstruct Australopithecine vocal capabilities. But we know they were doing something more sophisticated than their ancestors. The archaeological record shows no stone tools yet. Those would come later, with early Homo. But the social tools were already being forged. Gestures, vocalizations, facial expressions, body postures. The Australopithecines were building a vocabulary of cooperation. Now let's add females into this equation, because they weren't passive observers. They were active participants in reshaping Australopithecine society. Here's a female, we'll call her Zara, watching the interaction at the fig tree. She sees Alpha, large and dominant, controlling the resource. She also sees Beta and Gamma, smaller but working together, eventually gaining access to the food despite Alpha's aggression. From a purely genetic standpoint, Alpha looks like the better choice. His size suggests good genes, robust health, successful foraging. His dominance suggests he'll have priority access to resources, which could benefit Zara's offspring. But Zara is doing something more sophisticated than simple genetic calculation. She's evaluating social intelligence. She's watching who cooperates and who doesn't, who shares and who hoards, who stays calm under pressure and who erupts into costly aggression. She notices that Beta, after feeding in the fig tree, moves toward a female with a young juvenile and offers her some of the fruit he's gathered. It's not much, a few figs perhaps, but it's a transfer of resources. Alpha, meanwhile, feeds until satiated and then moves off, showing no interest in sharing. Zara is learning something crucial. The large, dominant male might have priority access to resources, but he's not sharing those resources. The smaller, coalition-forming males are. And if she mates with a coalition male, a male who cooperates, who shares, who has allies, her offspring will benefit from those resources and those alliances. Her infant won't just have a father, it will have uncles, so to speak. Protectors, provisioners. This is the mechanism by which female choice begins to favor cooperation over aggression. It's not that females consciously decided to remake Australopithecine society. It's that females who chose cooperative males had offspring who survived at higher rates. Generation by generation, the genetic architecture underlying cooperation spread through the population. But cooperation among males created a new problem: paternity certainty. In a harem system, the dominant male knows the offspring are his because he monopolizes access to females. In a multi-male, multi-female system, where males cooperate, how does a male know which infants are his? This is where pair bonding becomes essential. Not necessarily lifelong monogamy. The Australopithecine mating system was probably more flexible than that, but sustained partnerships between specific males and females. Relationships that lasted months or years rather than days. The fossil evidence suggests this was happening. That moderate sexual dimorphism we discussed earlier, males 50% heavier than females rather than twice as heavy, is the signature of a mating system in transition. Not quite monogamous, not quite polygynous, something in between. Something that anthropologists call mild polygyny with pair bonding. In this system, a male might form a primary partnership with one female while maintaining less intense relationships with others. The female benefits from sustained investment from her primary partner. The male benefits from relatively high paternity certainty with his primary partner's offspring. But maintaining pair bonds requires something revolutionary: the suppression of male sexual jealousy and aggression. A male who erupted into violence every time another male approached his partner would quickly find himself isolated, excluded from the coalition network that was becoming essential for survival. So we're watching the evolution of impulse control. Males who could manage their aggressive impulses, who could tolerate other males in proximity to their partners without immediately attacking, were more successful. Their coalitions held together. Their social networks remained intact. Their offspring benefited from the broader support system. The weaker males, or more accurately the less aggressive males, were building a new kind of strength, social strength. The ability to form alliances, maintain relationships, navigate complex social landscapes. And that social strength was being passed to their offspring. Let's zoom out for a moment and consider what's happening at the population level. We're 3 million years ago in East Africa, and Australopithecine populations are spreading. They're in Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania. They're adapting to different habitats, lakeshores, woodlands, more open grasslands. They're succeeding in environments where their more ape-like ancestors couldn't survive. And the secret to their success isn't physical. They're not bigger or stronger than their ancestors. They're not faster. They don't have better teeth or claws or any physical advantage. Their advantage is social. They're cooperating in ways their ancestors didn't. They're sharing food. They're forming coalitions. They're maintaining pair bonds. They're creating the first primitive version of what we might call culture. Learned behaviors passed from one generation to the next, not through genetics alone, but through observation and imitation. This is what paleontologist Rick Potts calls variability selection. The Australopithecines weren't adapting to one specific environment. They were adapting to variability itself, to unpredictability. And the way you adapt to unpredictability isn't through physical specialization. It's through behavioral flexibility, through intelligence, through cooperation. The shift from choosing the strongest male to choosing the smartest, most cooperative male wasn't a single event. It was a process that played out over hundreds of thousands of years across the entire species. But once it began, it created a feedback loop. Females who chose cooperative males had offspring who were more cooperative. Those offspring formed better coalitions, received more support, survived at higher rates. The genes for cooperation and for preferring cooperation in mates spread together through the population. Meanwhile, the purely physical competitors, the large, aggressive males who relied on dominance alone, found themselves at a disadvantage. They could still mate, certainly. Size and strength didn't disappear, but they were losing ground to the coalition builders. Their offspring were less likely to receive paternal investment, less likely to benefit from alliance networks, less likely to survive the dangerous juvenile period. Over time, the balance shifted. Cooperation became the dominant strategy. Aggression became the secondary option, and the Australopithecine mating system was transformed. But this transformation created new vulnerabilities. Cooperation is fragile. It requires trust, and trust can be exploited. What happens when a male pretends to cooperate but actually cheats, accepting help from coalition partners but not reciprocating? What happens when a male invests in a female's offspring that aren't actually his? These are the problems that would drive the next stage of human evolution: the development of moral emotions, guilt, shame, gratitude, resentment, the evolution of punishment and reputation management, the emergence of true language to enable more sophisticated coordination and communication. The Australopithecines were just beginning this journey. They had taken the first steps away from dominance hierarchies based purely on physical strength. They had begun to build societies based on reciprocity and cooperation. But they were still, in many ways, transitional creatures, still caught between the ape past and the human future. In the cooling shade of the acacia tree, Beta and Gamma sit near each other, grooming. It's not just about removing parasites, though that's certainly part of it. It's about maintaining their alliance, reinforcing their bond. Every stroke of fingers through hair is a small investment in their partnership. A reminder, we're in this together. Nearby, Zara watches. Her infant clings to her chest, eyes wide, taking in the scene. The infant is Beta's, probably. Zara and Beta have been partners for more than a year now. He brings her food regularly. He stays close when predators are near. He shows patience with the infant that Alpha never showed with his offspring. Zara made her choice, and in making that choice, she participated in one of the most important transitions in evolutionary history: the shift from power through dominance to power through alliance, from victory through strength to victory through cooperation. It was the choice that made humanity possible. But the journey was just beginning, because cooperation, once established, creates new possibilities, new behaviors, new ways of thinking and living, and those new possibilities would eventually lead to something unprecedented in the history of life on Earth. Creatures who didn't just adapt to their environment, but who began to adapt their environment to themselves. The weakest males were winning, and in their victory, they were creating something that had never existed before. They were creating us. The language of care. The afternoon heat shimmers across the grassland, and beneath the spreading crown of an acacia, a small drama unfolds. Beta sits with a juvenile, not his own offspring, but the young male born to another female in the group. The juvenile, perhaps 3 years old, is trying to crack open a hard-shelled fruit using a rock. He's failing. The fruit keeps rolling away. His strikes are uncoordinated, frustrated. Beta watches for several minutes. Then, slowly, deliberately, he picks up a different rock, one that's flatter, heavier, and demonstrates. He places the fruit in a small depression in the ground to stabilize it. He strikes with controlled force, not frantic hammering. The shell cracks. The juvenile watches intently. This moment, barely 5 minutes long, seemingly insignificant, represents something profound. Beta is teaching. Not in the way a mother might instinctively show her infant how to cling or suckle, but deliberately passing on learned information to an unrelated individual. This is cultural transmission, and it requires something that's invisible in the fossil record, but absolutely essential to understanding Australopithecine society. Complex communication. The Australopithecines were learning to talk. Now, we need to be careful here. The Australopithecines weren't having conversations about philosophy or planning next week's hunt in detail. Their vocal anatomy, judging from the size and shape of their vertebral canals and the basicranial flexion of their skulls, wasn't capable of the rapid, articulated speech that modern humans produce. They didn't have language in the sense we understand it today. But they had something more sophisticated than the calls and gestures of chimps or gorillas. Something that allowed them to coordinate coalition behavior, maintain social bonds across time and space, and transmit learned information to their offspring. Anthropologist Robin Dunbar proposed a radical idea in the 1990s. Language evolved not for hunting coordination or tool-making instruction, but for gossip, for social bonding in increasingly large groups. When primate groups grow beyond about 50 individuals, physical grooming becomes impossible as the primary bonding mechanism. There simply aren't enough hours in the day for everyone to groom everyone else adequately. You need a more efficient way to maintain social cohesion. That more efficient way was proto-language. Vocalizations that could be produced while foraging or walking, that could reach multiple individuals simultaneously, that could convey social information. Who's trustworthy? Who cheated in the last food-sharing event? Who's forming a coalition with whom? The Australopithecines were living in groups that were pushing up against this limit. The fossil assemblages suggest group sizes of 20 to 30 individuals, right at the threshold where grooming alone becomes insufficient. They needed a new bonding mechanism, and they were developing it. Listen to the sounds of the Australopithecine group as the afternoon progresses. There's a constant low-level vocalization, not the dramatic pant hoots of chimps or the roaring of gorillas, but something more sustained and modulated. Soft calls between mothers and infants. Slightly louder calls between coalition partners coordinating their movements. Warning calls when a predator is spotted in the distance, but with variation. Different calls for different predators, perhaps. A leopard warning versus a hyena warning versus the sharp, urgent call that means saber-tooth. And crucially, there's something that sounds almost like conversation. Beta and gamma sit near each other, and they're making alternating vocalizations. Not just random sounds, but patterned exchanges. Beta makes a series of sounds. Gamma responds with a different series. Beta vocalizes again, and his pattern references something from his previous vocalization. There's repetition with variation. What are they saying? We can't know, but the structure suggests they're exchanging information. Perhaps about where they found food earlier. Perhaps about alpha's behavior and whether they need to be cautious. Perhaps simply reinforcing their social bond, the vocal equivalent of grooming. This is proto-conversation, the evolutionary precursor to language, and it's being driven by the same social pressures that favored cooperation over aggression. The need to coordinate, to maintain alliances, to navigate an increasingly complex social world. But communication is about more than just sounds. The Australopithecines were also masters of what primatologists call ostensive communication, deliberate signaling designed to capture attention and convey information. Watch Beta teaching that juvenile to crack nuts. Before he demonstrates, he does something subtle but critical. He catches the juvenile's eye. He holds the gaze for a moment. Then he looks deliberately at the rock he's about to pick up, then back at the juvenile. The message is clear. Pay attention to this. What I'm about to do is important. This is for you. This is called joint attention, and it's foundational to all teaching and learning. Parent and child must be focused on the same thing simultaneously, and both must know that the other is focused on it. It seems simple, but it's remarkably rare in nature. Chimps show limited joint attention. Most primates don't show it at all, but australopithecines needed it. Because cooperation doesn't work if you can't coordinate attention. If beta and gamma are going to approach alpha's fig tree from opposite sides, they need to be able to communicate. I'm going to move now. Watch me. When I move, you move too. Are you ready? Gestures became part of the vocabulary. A subtle head tilt toward a location. A hand movement indicating direction. Eye gaze used to direct another's attention. These weren't random movements. They were deliberate signals, understood by both sender and receiver. And here's the fascinating part. Gestures work at a distance. Vocalizations can be heard, but gestures can be seen across a clearing or through brush. In a world where predators are listening, where stealth sometimes matters, visual communication has advantages. The Australopithecines were becoming multimodal communicators, using voice, gesture, facial expression, and body posture in combination. They were building the toolkit that would eventually become human language. But communication is only valuable if it's honest, and honesty is only maintained if dishonesty is punished. This creates one of the most important dynamics in Australopithecine society, the emergence of reputation. Imagine Gamma decides to cheat. Beta and Gamma have a coalition. They've helped each other access food, warned each other about predators, supported each other in conflicts. But one day, when Alpha is distracted and Beta signals to Gamma that now is the time to approach the food source, Gamma doesn't move. He hangs back, letting Beta take the risk of Alpha's aggression while Gamma waits to see if the coast is clear. Beta notices. Of course he notices, and he remembers. The next time Gamma needs help, perhaps he's found a large food source he can't exploit alone, or he's being harassed by Alpha and needs coalition support, Beta doesn't help. When Gamma signals, Beta ignores him. The alliance is broken, or at least damaged. But it's not just Beta who notices. Zara was watching. So was another male, Delta. So were several juveniles. Gamma's cheating wasn't a private betrayal. It was a public one. His reputation is damaged. Other individuals become less willing to cooperate with him. He's being socially excluded, not through formal punishment, but through the gradual withdrawal of cooperative opportunities. This is reputation management, and it's the foundation of all complex cooperation. It requires memory, the ability to track past interactions over time. It requires communication, the ability to share information about who's trustworthy and who isn't. And it requires what psychologists call indirect reciprocity. I help you not because you've helped me, but because you've helped others, and I've heard about it. The Australopithecine brain was becoming a social calculation engine. Every interaction was being evaluated. Every exchange was being remembered. And that information was shaping future behavior. Now, female choice enters this dynamic in a crucial way. Because when Zara chooses a mate, she's not just evaluating size or strength anymore. She's evaluating reputation. A male who has a reputation for cooperation, who helps coalition partners, who shares food, who maintains his commitments, is a valuable mate. His social network becomes accessible to Zara and her offspring. His reputation provides a kind of social insurance. If Zara's infant is threatened, that male's coalition partners might intervene. If food is scarce, that male's network might share resources. Conversely, A male with a poor reputation, known for cheating, for taking help without reciprocating, for abandoning commitments, is a risky mate. Even if he's large and strong, his social isolation means Zara's offspring won't benefit from alliance networks. They'll be on their own in a world where cooperation is becoming essential. So Zara is listening. When Beta and the other females vocalize about Gamma's betrayal, because they are vocalizing about it in their proto-language way, Zara is gathering information. She's updating her internal model of who's trustworthy and who isn't, who would make a good partner and who wouldn't. This creates a powerful selection pressure on males. Reputation matters as much as physical prowess. A male who can't maintain positive relationships, who can't be trusted, is reproductively disadvantaged, even if he's physically impressive. The selection pressure for social intelligence intensifies. Males need to be smart enough not just to form alliances, but to maintain them over time, to remember past exchanges, to reciprocate appropriately, to manage their reputation actively. Let's introduce a new character, Epsilon, a young male just reaching adulthood. He's small, smaller than Beta, much smaller than Alpha. In the old system, in the world of his ancestors 1,000,000 years earlier, he'd have no chance. He'd be excluded from mating opportunities, possibly driven from the group entirely. But this is a new world. Epsilon has been watching. He's been learning. He grew up observing Beta and Gamma's coalition, watching how they coordinate, noting that they're successful not despite their smaller size, but because of their cooperation. Epsilon begins deliberately cultivating relationships. When he finds a good foraging spot, he doesn't just exploit it alone. He makes soft vocalizations that draw others to the location. When a female with a young infant is struggling to crack tough seeds, he helps. Not with any immediate expectation of reward, but building credit, building reputation. He's particularly attentive to Zara. He's watched her infant play, and when the infant gets separated from Zara during a predator alarm, Epsilon is the one who helps guide the infant back to safety. Zara notices. She remembers. Epsilon is also careful with his coalition choices. He approaches Beta, making submissive gestures, offering grooming. He's signaling, "I'm not a threat to you. I respect your status, but I could be valuable as an ally." He shares food with Beta. He supports Beta in a minor conflict with another young male. Beta accepts these overtures. Why? Because coalitions are strength, and an additional partner makes the coalition more powerful. Epsilon is small, but he's observant and reliable. Those traits have value. Over months, Epsilon builds his network. He forms strong bonds with Beta and another mid-ranking male. He maintains positive relationships with several females. He helps with juveniles. His reputation grows. Epsilon is trustworthy. Epsilon cooperates. Epsilon remembers and reciprocates. When mating season arrives, though Australopithecines likely didn't have a strict seasonal breeding pattern, there would still have been periods of peak female receptivity. Epsilon is surprisingly successful. Alpha mates with several females, yes. His size and dominance still matter. But so does Epsilon. Multiple females accept his advances, including, eventually, Zara. Epsilon's small size should have been a fatal disadvantage. Instead, by mastering the social game, by building reputation and alliances, he's become reproductively successful. This is the new reality of Australopithecine society. The game has changed. And language, primitive, gestural, vocal proto-language, is the technology that makes the new game possible. But there's a darker side to all this, because if communication can build cooperation, it can also enable deception. And if reputation matters, then manipulating reputation becomes valuable. Imagine another male. We'll call him Zeta. Zeta has figured something out. You can gain the benefits of cooperation without paying the costs, at least in the short term, if you're clever about it. Zeta helps others when witnesses are present. He makes a show of sharing food, of supporting coalition partners, but only when others are watching. When he's alone with another individual, his behavior is different. He takes without reciprocating. He makes promises through gesture and vocalization that he doesn't keep. For a while, this works. Zeta builds a reputation for cooperation while actually being quite selfish. He's manipulating the reputation system. He's being dishonest. But dishonesty requires cognitive sophistication. Zeta needs to track who knows what. He needs to behave differently with different individuals depending on what they've witnessed. He needs to manage different faces for different social contexts. This is called Machiavellian intelligence, and it's cognitively expensive. It requires working memory, impulse control, theory of mind, and strategic planning. The fact that it's even possible in Australopithecine society tells us something important. Their cognitive abilities were advancing rapidly. But Zeta's strategy has risks. Because the Australopithecine communication network is getting denser, information flows more quickly. When Zeta cheats an individual in private, that individual can communicate about it to others. Zeta's private betrayals become public knowledge. Eventually, Zeta's reputation catches up with him. The group becomes wary of him. Coalition partners abandon him. Females avoid him. He's not physically expelled from the group. That's not how Australopithecine society works, but he's socially isolated. And in a world where cooperation determines access to resources and mates, social isolation is a death sentence for reproductive success. The communication network that enables cooperation also enables the detection and punishment of cheaters. Language, even primitive proto-language, makes cooperation stable because it makes reputation trackable across the entire group. As the sun begins to set over the afar landscape, the Australopithecine group gathers in a large acacia tree for the night. They'll sleep in the branches, relatively safe from ground predators. The arrangement isn't random. Close allies sleep near each other. Mothers with infants cluster together. Coalition partners maintain proximity. Beta and Epsilon settle onto a large branch together, their earlier grooming session having reinforced their alliance. Nearby, Zara positions herself with her infant, Beta close enough to provide protection, but not so close as to crowd them. This is their arrangement now, not a breeding pair in the strict sense, but partners, a unit within the larger social network. Gamma, Beta's original coalition partner, is on another branch near Delta. Their relationship with Beta remains intact, but it's been affected by past interactions. Trust, once slightly damaged, takes time to fully rebuild. The social memory of the group is long. Alpha sleeps higher in the tree, alone. He's still the largest male, still dominant in direct confrontations, but he's isolated. He has no close allies, no coalition partners. When food is scarce or predators are near, he'll rely on individual strength. It works, mostly, but it's a more precarious existence than Beta's coalition-based strategy. And Zeta? He's at the edge of the group, on a lower branch. Not excluded entirely, but not integrated. His isolation is the group's informal punishment for his manipulative behavior. He can rejoin the cooperative network, but only by rebuilding his reputation through consistent, genuine cooperation over time. The group remembers. The communication network has done its job. As darkness falls, soft vocalizations pass through the tree. Contact calls. I'm here, you're there, we're together. These aren't the dramatic vocalizations of chimps settling for the night, all screaming and displaying. These are quieter, more sustained, almost conversational. The Australopithecines are talking to each other, not with words as we understand them, but with proto-words, sounds that reference things and concepts, patterns that convey social information. A communication system complex enough to coordinate cooperation, maintain alliances, manage reputation. This is the foundation. In 500,000 years, this proto-language will become more sophisticated. In 1,000,000 years, it will enable cooperative hunting and long-distance coordination. In 2,000,000 years, it will become the symbolic language that allows humans to tell stories, share myths, and transmit complex cultural knowledge across generations. But here, now, in this acacia tree in the Pliocene twilight, the Australopithecines are taking the first steps. They're building the cognitive and communicative infrastructure that makes cooperation possible. They're creating the social world in which smaller, weaker, but smarter and more cooperative males can thrive. The revolution isn't just biological. It's not just about brain size or body proportions. It's social. It's happening in the relationships between individuals, in the networks of cooperation and communication that are rewiring how natural selection operates. Female choice favored cooperation. Cooperation required communication. Communication enabled reputation management. Reputation management stabilized cooperation. And stable cooperation created new niches, new ways of surviving and reproducing that didn't depend on individual physical dominance. The weakest males weren't just surviving anymore, they were thriving. And in their success, they were creating something unprecedented. A species where social intelligence mattered more than physical power, where networks mattered more than individual strength, where cooperation could defeat competition. The future belonged to them. The future belonged to the smart, the social, the cooperative. The future belonged to us. The cost of cooperation. Dawn breaks over the Ethiopian highlands, and the Australopithecine group descends from their sleeping tree. But this morning is different. During the night, something has changed. One of the females, we'll call her Theta, has entered estrus. Her sexual swelling is pronounced, visible, unmistakable. And every male in the group knows it. This is the moment when cooperation faces its greatest test. Because sexual access is the ultimate evolutionary currency. All the coalition building, all the reputation management, all the cooperative food sharing, it all comes down to this. Who gets to mate? Who passes their genes to the next generation? In a chimp community, the answer is simple and brutal. The alpha male monopolizes access to estrus females, fighting off rivals with savage efficiency. Smaller males might sneak matings when the alpha isn't watching, but these are furtive, risky encounters. The system is built on dominance and violence. But the Australopithecines have built something different. And now, we'll see whether that something different can survive the most intense selection pressure evolution can produce. Competition for reproductive access. Alpha notices Theta immediately. He approaches, displaying his size, his strength. In the old system, the system that governed his ancestors, this would be enough. He would mate, other males would retreat, and that would be the end of it. But beta doesn't retreat. Neither does gamma. Neither does epsilon. They don't challenge alpha directly. That would be suicidal. But they don't leave either. They maintain their positions near theta, watching, waiting. Alpha displays more aggressively. He charges toward beta, lips pulled back, arms raised. It's an intimidation display designed to scatter rivals. Beta backs up several steps, showing submission. But then something unexpected happens. Gamma moves closer to theta from the other side, and epsilon positions himself at yet another angle. Alpha is surrounded. Not by challengers who want to fight him, they're all showing submissive signals, but by persistent males who won't leave. And he can't chase all of them simultaneously. This is the coalition strategy applied to mating competition, and it changes everything. Over the next several hours, a complex dance unfolds. Alpha attempts to maintain exclusive access to theta, but the coalition males, beta, gamma, and epsilon, continuously position themselves nearby. When Alpha focuses on one, the others move closer. When he charges, they retreat, but only briefly. They're testing his limits, his stamina, his willingness to sustain constant aggression. And here's the critical factor. Sustained aggression is expensive. Alpha is burning energy with every display, every charge, every attempt to intimidate. The coalition males, meanwhile, are conserving energy. They're not fighting, they're just being persistent, being present. By midday, Alpha is visibly exhausted. His displays have become less frequent, less intense. He's still the largest male, still dominant, but he can't maintain exclusive access anymore. The coalition males have won through attrition. Theta mates with Alpha, but she also mates with Beta and with Epsilon. The coalition males have successfully accessed a reproductive opportunity that, in a pure dominant system, would have been monopolized by the largest male. But notice what didn't happen. The coalition males didn't fight each other. Beta could have attempted to exclude Epsilon. Gamma could have tried to prevent Beta from mating. They had moments of opportunity to betray their coalition and claim exclusive access. But they didn't. Why? The answer lies in what game theorists call repeated games, and what evolutionary biologists call future shadow of interaction. Beta, gamma, and epsilon aren't making one-time decisions. They're making decisions within a long-term relationship. If Beta betrays the coalition today to gain exclusive mating access, he destroys the coalition. And he needs that coalition, not just for this mating opportunity, but for all the future interactions that will determine his survival and reproductive success. Food sharing, predator defense, access to resources, support in conflicts. All of this depends on maintaining coalition bonds. Betraying those bonds for short-term reproductive gain would be evolutionarily stupid, because the long-term costs would outweigh the short-term benefits. This is the key insight. Cooperation can be evolutionarily stable, but only when individuals interact repeatedly over time, and when defection carries long-term costs that exceed short-term benefits. The Australopithecines have created a social structure where this condition is met. Their groups are stable. Individuals interact with the same partners repeatedly over months and years. Reputation matters. Coalition bonds matter. And the benefits of maintaining those bonds outweigh the benefits of betraying them. But this system has a price. And that price is something that would haunt human evolution forever. Sexual jealousy must be suppressed. Watch Beta's face as Theta mates with Alpha. There's tension there. You can see it in the set of his jaw. the slight raising of his shoulders. He's experiencing something, some emotion, some impulse toward aggression or intervention. But he doesn't act on it. He sits several meters away, occasionally glancing over, but mostly focusing on grooming with Epsilon. He's managing his emotional response, controlling an impulse that, in his ancestors, would have been uncontrollable. This is one of the most important and least discussed aspects of human evolution, the development of emotional regulation. For cooperation to work, Australopithecine males had to evolve the capacity to tolerate situations that their primate brains screamed were intolerable. Watching potential mates copulate with rivals, sharing resources when instinct said to hoard, helping offspring that might not be genetically their own. Every one of these behaviors requires overriding powerful emotional impulses, and that requires prefrontal cortex development. Enhanced connections between the emotion-generating limbic system and the impulse-controlling frontal lobes. The evolution of what psychologists call executive function, the ability to inhibit automatic responses and act according to long-term goals rather than immediate desires. The fossil evidence shows this was happening. Those expanding frontal lobes in Australopithecine endocasts weren't just for social calculation. They were for self-control. The ability to feel jealousy, anger, possessiveness, but not act on those feelings destructively. This is harder than it sounds. Modern humans, with vastly larger prefrontal cortices, still struggle with this constantly. Jealousy, sexual possessiveness, and mate-guarding instincts are deeply embedded in our psychology. The Australopithecines were just beginning to develop the neural architecture to manage these impulses. And it was hard, costly, but necessary. But suppressing sexual jealousy creates a new problem: paternity uncertainty. If multiple males mate with the same female, how does any male know which offspring are his? In many species, this would prevent paternal investment. Male lions don't provision cubs because paternity is uncertain. Male chimps don't provision infants for the same reason. Why invest costly resources in offspring that might not carry your genes? The Australopithecines solved this problem through pair bonding. Not perfect monogamy. The fossil evidence and the mating dynamics we've just observed show that Australopithecine mating was more flexible than that. But sustained preferential partnerships between specific males and females. Theta has mated with multiple males, but she has a primary partner, Beta. They've been associated for over a year. They sleep near each other in the night tree. They forage in proximity during the day. Beta provides food to Theta more consistently than other males do. When predators threaten, Beta positions himself between Theta and danger. This relationship gives Beta probabilistic paternity confidence. Theta's infant might not be his. There's perhaps a 60 to 70% chance it is, given the multiple matings. But 60 to 70% is enough. The math works out. Investing in an infant that has a 70% chance of being yours is evolutionarily better than not investing in any infants at all. And here's where female choice becomes crucial again. Theta benefits from having multiple males invest in her offspring. The more males who think they might be the father, the more resources and protection her infant receives. But she also benefits from having one primary partner who invests most heavily. That requires maintaining the pair bond, staying close to Beta, accepting his food offerings, allowing him preferential mating access during her most fertile period. It's a delicate balance. Theta is managing multiple relationships simultaneously, each calibrated to extract maximum benefit while maintaining stability. She's not consciously strategizing. This isn't deliberate Machiavellian manipulation. It's evolved behavior, shaped by natural selection over hundreds of thousands of years. Females whose behavior maintained this balance had offspring who survived at higher rates. That behavior became encoded in the genetic architecture of the species. But not every male accepts this arrangement. Remember Zeta, the male we met earlier who tried to manipulate the reputation system? He's watching the mating dynamics with Theta, and he's drawing conclusions. Zeta sees that coalition males get mating access, but he also sees that coalition membership requires sustained cooperation, food sharing, reciprocity, all costly behaviors. What if there's a shortcut? What if you can gain the benefits of coalition membership without paying the costs? Zeta begins attempting what evolutionary biologists call sneaky mating. When the coalition males are distracted, when alpha is resting, Zeta tries to quickly mate with Theta. No courtship, no coalition membership, no investment. Just opportunistic copulation. The first time, it works. Theta is focused on foraging, and Zeta approaches quickly. The mating is brief, and he retreats before anyone intervenes. He's potentially contributed genes to the next generation without investing any resources. But the other males notice. Beta sees what happened. So does Gamma. And their response is immediate and harsh. They don't attack Zeta directly. Australopithecine aggression is still relatively constrained compared to chimps. But they exclude him. When Zeta tries to join a foraging party, Beta and Gamma block him with their bodies, not violently, but firmly. When food is being shared, Zeta receives nothing. When Zeta vocalizes for coalition support in a conflict with another male, no one responds. Zeta is being socially punished, and that punishment has teeth. Without coalition support, Zeta's access to resources decreases. He forages less efficiently. He's more vulnerable to predators. And critically, his future mating opportunities plummet because females avoid males who are socially isolated. That one sneaky mating might have produced offspring, but Zeta's overall reproductive success decreases because his social isolation prevents future mating opportunities and reduces his survival probability. This is how cooperation remains stable even in the face of sexual competition. Defection is possible, but it's punished. Not through violence necessarily, but through social exclusion. And in a species where cooperation is becoming essential for survival, social exclusion is devastating. The punishment doesn't even need to be coordinated or conscious. It emerges naturally from the dynamics of the reputation system. Zeta violated the implicit rules. He attempted to gain reproductive benefits without contributing to coalition costs. That violation damaged his reputation. Other individuals, acting in their own self-interest, avoid cooperating with individuals who have poor reputations. The result is that Zeta is excluded, not through group decision, but through the cumulative effect of individuals protecting their own interests. This is what allows cooperation to evolve and remain stable. Punishment is automatic, decentralized, and effective. But it requires something that we haven't yet fully explored: the evolution of moral emotions. Beta didn't just exclude Zeta rationally, calculating costs and benefits. He felt something: anger at the violation, indignation, a sense that Zeta's behavior was wrong, not just disadvantageous. These emotions, what psychologists call moral emotions, are the psychological mechanisms that enforce cooperation. They motivate punishment of defectors even when punishment is costly to the punisher. They create visceral, automatic responses to violations of cooperative norms, and they're beginning to evolve in the Australopithecines. As evening approaches, the group settles into their sleeping tree again. But tonight, the social landscape has shifted. Theta's estrus period is ending, and the tensions around mating competition are subsiding. But the consequences of the day's interactions will persist. Beta and Epsilon's coalition is stronger. They successfully coordinated to gain mating access, and they didn't betray each other in the process. That success reinforces their bond, making future cooperation more likely. Alpha is still dominant, still the largest male, but he's learned something. He cannot monopolize access to estrus females through intimidation alone. The coalition males are too persistent, too coordinated. His strategy is less effective than it would have been in his ancestors' world. Zeta is isolated, sleeping on a low branch away from the core group. His attempted defection has cost him social standing, and rebuilding that standing will require months of consistent cooperative behavior. He might manage it. Redemption is possible in Australopithecine society, but the path is difficult. And Theta? She carries the genetic material of multiple males, but her primary bond with Beta remains intact. She's navigated the complex dynamics of the mating period, extracting resources and protection from multiple males while maintaining the pair bond that provides stability for her future offspring. The system works. It's messy, imperfect, filled with tensions and contradictions. Sexual jealousy hasn't been eliminated. It's been managed. Defection hasn't been made impossible. It's been made costly. Cooperation isn't automatic. It's maintained through constant monitoring, reputation management, and social enforcement. But it works. The coalition males are reproductively successful despite being smaller and weaker than alpha. Cooperation is defeating dominance. Social intelligence is outcompeting physical strength. And the cost of this cooperation, the emotional regulation required, the cognitive effort of reputation management, the constant negotiation of social relationships, is driving brain evolution forward. Creating selection pressure for larger brains, more sophisticated social cognition, better impulse control. The Australopithecines are paying the price of cooperation, but they're reaping the benefits. And in the long run, those benefits will transform them from upright apes into something unprecedented. They're becoming human. But cooperation has one more trick up its evolutionary sleeve. One more transformation that will take these Australopithecine innovations and amplify them beyond anything seen before in nature. Because cooperation doesn't just allow individuals to survive better, it allows groups to compete with other groups, and that creates a whole new level of selection. We're about to witness the birth of tribal thinking, of us versus them, of loyalty to the group that will eventually become the foundation of human culture, human warfare, and human civilization. The revolution is accelerating. When groups go to war. The wet season has failed. For the second year in a row, the rains that should have arrived in November never came. The grasslands are brown and brittle, the woodland streams reduced to muddy trickles. The fig trees that normally fruit prolifically are sparse, their offerings meager. The Australopithecine group we've been following, Beta's group we'll call them, is hungry. They're not alone in their hunger. Across the afar landscape, every Australopithecine group is feeling the pressure. Resources that would normally support dozens of groups are now barely sufficient for a few. And this scarcity is about to reveal something dark about cooperation. It works beautifully within groups, but it creates something terrible between groups. Beta's group is moving toward a water source, a spring-fed pool that remains even during droughts. They've been there before. It's within their normal ranging area. But as they approach through the scattered acacias, they hear vocalizations. Not their own calls, different patterns, different rhythms. Another group is already at the water. This is the moment when human evolution takes its darkest turn. Because cooperation within groups creates competition between groups. The same coalition building, the same social bonding, the same reputation management that allows beta, gamma, and epsilon to work together also creates a boundary, us versus them. In chimp society, intergroup encounters are violent and often lethal. Male chimps patrol territorial boundaries, and when they encounter members of neighboring groups, especially if they outnumber them, they attack with savage efficiency. Jane Goodall documented a 4-year war at Gombe, in which one chimp community systematically hunted down and killed all the males of a neighboring community. The Australopithecines inherited this capacity for intergroup aggression from their ancestors. But they were also doing something their ancestors didn't do. They were cooperating in larger, more coordinated groups. And that made intergroup conflict potentially more organized, more strategic, and more deadly. Beta's group halts at the edge of the clearing around the water source. They can see the other group clearly now, perhaps 20 individuals, similar in size to their own group. The other group has noticed them too. Vocalizations increase in volume and intensity on both sides. Not quite threat calls, but not friendly either. Tension calls. Uncertainty calls. Alpha, despite being somewhat socially isolated within Beta's group, takes the lead here. This is what dominance is for. Not managing internal group dynamics, where coalition building works better, but representing the group in external conflicts. Alpha moves forward, displaying. Arms raised, body enlarged, vocalizing loudly. He's signaling, "We're here. We're strong. This is our water source." But he doesn't charge blindly forward, because behind him, beta, gamma, epsilon, and several other males are arranged in a loose formation. They're not scattered individuals. They're a coordinated group. And that coordination changes the dynamics entirely. The other group's dominant male, we'll call him Omega, displays in response. He's large, perhaps slightly larger than Alpha. In a one-on-one confrontation, he might win. But this isn't one-on-one. Behind Omega, his group's males are also forming up, but their coordination seems less tight, more chaotic. For several minutes, both groups display at each other from a distance of perhaps 20 meters. The displays are ritualized, designed to communicate strength without immediately resorting to violence. Violence is risky. Even the winner of a fight can be injured, and in a world of leopards and saber-tooths, injury is often fatal. But displays only work if both sides are willing to back down. And with water this scarce, neither group can afford to leave. What happens next reveals something crucial about Australopithecine social evolution. Beta moves up beside Alpha, then Gamma, then epsilon. They're not challenging Alpha's leadership in this moment. They're supporting it. The coalition males who compete with Alpha for internal status are cooperating with him for external defense. This is called nested hierarchy in evolutionary biology. Within-group competition is real and constant, but it's subordinated to between-group cooperation when external threats appear. The males who would normally be rivals become allies when facing outsiders, and this creates a new selection pressure. Groups that cooperate more effectively in intergroup conflicts are more successful. They maintain access to critical resources. Their members survive at higher rates. Their offspring thrive, while neighboring groups' offspring starve. Beta's group has an advantage. Their internal cooperation is sophisticated. The coalition bonds formed through food sharing and reputation management translate into battlefield coordination. When Alpha signals, a specific vocalization combined with a body orientation, Beta and the other coalition males understand. They move in coordinated fashion, maintaining formation. The other group lacks this coordination. Their males are individually formidable, but they're not operating as a unit. When Omega charges forward, his coalition males don't immediately support him. There's hesitation, confusion about who should move where. Beta's group advances, not running, not attacking yet, but moving forward in a coordinated line. The message is clear. We're willing to fight, and we'll fight as a coordinated group, not as individuals. Omega's group breaks. Not all at once, but gradually. First, a few juveniles retreat, then some females. The males hold longer, but without support from the rest of the group, their displays lose credibility. Finally, Omega himself backs down, turning away from the confrontation. Beta's group has won without bloodshed. They have access to the water, and they won because their internal cooperation translated into external competitive advantage. But let's be clear about what just happened. This wasn't a moral victory. This wasn't justice. Beta's group didn't have more right to the water than Omega's group. Both groups needed it equally desperately. Both groups were just trying to survive. Beta's group won because they cooperated better. And the consequence of that victory is that Omega's group must find water elsewhere if they can. Their juveniles will be weaker. Their females will produce less milk. Their offspring survival rate will drop. Cooperation within groups creates tragedy between groups. The same social bonds that we've celebrated, the coalition building, the food sharing, the reputation management, all of this makes groups more effective at competing with other groups. And in a zero-sum competition for scarce resources, one group's success is another group's failure. This is the dark heart of human social evolution. We're a supremely cooperative species, but our cooperation is parochial. It works within group boundaries, but it creates and reinforces those boundaries. Us versus them. Insider versus outsider. Ally versus enemy. The Australopithecines were beginning to experience this dynamic, and it would only intensify as human evolution progressed. Over the following days, Beta's group maintains control of the water source. They drink in the morning and evening, conserving energy during the hottest hours by resting in shade near the water. Their nutritional state stabilizes. Infants stop whimpering constantly from thirst. Adults have enough energy to forage more effectively in the surrounding area. But something has changed in the group's psychology. The males who cooperated in the confrontation with Omega's group have bonded more intensely. There's a new level of trust, of cohesion. They successfully coordinated in a high-stakes situation, and that success reinforces their social bonds. Beta, gamma, epsilon, and even alpha, males who would normally be competitors for status and mating access, now share something else: a common external threat, a successful group defense. They're not just coalition partners anymore. They're something closer to what we might call warriors, defenders of group resources against outsiders. And the females have noticed. Because here's another wrinkle in the sexual selection story. Females are choosing not just males who cooperate within the group, but males who defend the group against external threats. A male who shares food is valuable, yes, but a male who risks himself to defend water access during drought is even more valuable. His bravery benefits not just his own offspring, but all offspring in the group. This creates a new selection pressure, favoring what psychologists call parochial altruism, cooperation and self-sacrifice for group members, combined with hostility toward outsiders. Males who possess this trait are attractive to females, successful in male coalitions, and valuable to the entire group. The genetics underlying parochial altruism spread through the Australopithecine population. Not uniformly, there's still variation, still individuals who are more or less willing to take risks for group defense, but on average, the tendency increases. However, 3 days after the confrontation, scouts from Beta's group, young adult males ranging at the edges of the group's territory, report seeing members of Omega's group in the distance. They're moving away, possibly toward a more distant water source. The scouts vocalize the information back to the main group. This is significant. Information about other groups is being actively gathered and communicated. Beta's group is monitoring Omega's group, not just when they encounter them directly, but tracking their movements over time. This requires cognitive investment, remembering which individuals belong to which group, tracking their locations, predicting their likely movements. The Australopithecine brain is being shaped by intergroup competition just as much as by intragroup cooperation. The ability to categorize individuals into in-group and out-group, to remember past intergroup encounters, to predict future conflicts, to coordinate group defense and offense. All of this requires cognitive machinery, neural circuits dedicated to social cognition at the group level. And here's where it gets really interesting. The same cognitive abilities that enable intergroup competition also enable something else. They enable what anthropologists call symbolic group markers, ways of signaling who belongs to your group and who doesn't. We can't know exactly what form this took in Australopithecines. They weren't using language sophisticated enough for tribal names or origin myths. They probably weren't using visual markers like body paint or distinctive clothing, though some researchers have speculated about the use of ochre even this early. The evidence is ambiguous. But they were doing something. Perhaps distinctive vocalization patterns, dialects essentially, that marked group membership. Perhaps subtle differences in gesture or body posture learned through observation of group members. Perhaps preferences for specific foraging locations or movement patterns that created group-specific behavioral signatures. Whatever the mechanism, Australopithecines were beginning to develop the cognitive capacity to distinguish us from them in ways that went beyond individual recognition. They were beginning to think tribally. But tribal thinking has costs, and those costs were about to become apparent. Because while Beta's group is focused on competing with Omega's group, a different threat is approaching. One that doesn't care about Australopithecine group boundaries or social dynamics. A pack of 5 giant hyenas, Pachycrocuta brevirostris, each one weighing close to 200 pounds, with jaws powerful enough to crack elephant bones, is ranging through the area. They've been driven toward the water source by the same drought affecting the Australopithecines, and they've noticed that the waterhole is occupied by small, vulnerable primates. The hyenas approach at dusk, when Australopithecine vision is poorest, and when the group is transitioning from daytime foraging to nighttime sleeping. They move with the coordination of experienced pack hunters, spreading out to approach from multiple angles. The alarm goes up, sharp, urgent vocalizations from the juveniles who spot the hyenas first. The group reacts immediately, but there's momentary confusion. They're spread out around the waterhole, and the sleeping tree is 50 meters away, distance that must be covered while hyenas are closing in. Alpha, beta, and the other adult males don't flee toward the tree. They move toward the threat. Not attacking, that would be suicide, but displaying, vocalizing, throwing rocks and sticks, creating noise and movement to confuse the predators, drawing attention to themselves and away from the females and juveniles who are moving as fast as possible toward safety. This is costly altruism in its purest form. The males are increasing their own risk to reduce risk for others. And notice who benefits. Not just their own offspring, but all offspring in the group. Beta is risking his life for Theta's infant, yes, but also for infants sired by other males. Gamma is protecting juveniles that are definitely not his genetic offspring. Why? Because group selection is operating here. Groups where males defend the collective against predators survive at higher rates than groups where males flee immediately and leave everyone else vulnerable. The genes underlying this defensive behavior, whatever those genes are, probably influencing testosterone, aggression, fear response, coalition loyalty. Those genes spread because groups carrying those genes outcompete groups lacking them. The confrontation lasts only minutes, but feels eternal. The hyenas are testing the defenses, looking for weakness, for an individual separated from the group who can be taken without risk. But the adult males maintain a loose line between the predators and the fleeing females and juveniles. They're coordinated, not through deliberate strategy, but through evolved behavioral tendencies honed over hundreds of thousands of years of similar encounters. One hyena breaks through, making a run toward a young juvenile who stumbled and fell behind. But Beta and Epsilon converge on it immediately, not attacking directly, but harassing from the sides, forcing the hyena to turn and defend itself rather than pursue the juvenile. The juvenile scrambles to its feet and continues toward the tree. Eventually, the cost-benefit calculation shifts in the hyena's favor. There's easier prey elsewhere, less defended, and these primates are putting up too much coordinated resistance. The pack withdraws, and the Australopithecines reach their sleeping tree, climbing rapidly into the relative safety of the branches. They survived, but barely. And in the days that follow, something has changed in the group's behavior. The males who coordinated the defense against the hyenas have bonded even more intensely. There's a level of trust now that goes beyond food sharing or mating coalition support. These males risked their lives together, and that shared risk creates social bonds of exceptional strength. Evolutionary psychologists call this costly signaling. When Beta positioned himself between the hyenas and the group, he sent an unfakeable signal about his commitment to the group. Signals that are cheap, like vocalizations or displays, can be faked. But signals that carry real cost, like risking death to defend others, cannot be faked. Either you do it, or you don't. There's no in-between. Females observe these costly signals, and they factor them into mate choice. Beta was already an attractive mate because of his coalition membership and his food-sharing behavior. But now he's proven something else. When crisis comes, he doesn't flee. He defends. That's information that matters enormously for offspring survival. Zara, Beta's primary partner, reinforces their bond through increased proximity and grooming. Other females become more receptive to Beta as well. The males who coordinated the defense, Beta, Gamma, Epsilon, even Alpha, all see increases in their social status and mating opportunities. Meanwhile, males who hung back during the defense, who climbed to the tree more quickly, who didn't position themselves between the predators and the group, those males see their status decline. Not dramatically, not through formal punishment, but through subtle shifts in how others interact with them. Less grooming, fewer food-sharing interactions, reduced coalition support. The group has collectively updated its reputation assessments based on behavior during crisis. And those updated assessments will influence social dynamics for months to come. But here's the crucial insight. The same psychological mechanisms that enable males to coordinate defense against predators also enable them to coordinate aggression against other groups. The costly signaling that attracts mates when directed at hyenas can also attract mates when directed at Omega's group. The coalition bonds forged in predator defense translate directly into offensive capability in intergroup conflict. 5 days after the hyena attack, Beta's group encounters a small subgroup from Omega's community. 3 females and several juveniles, separated from their main group, foraging near the disputed water source. In normal times, such an encounter might lead to displays and mutual avoidance. Resources are typically plentiful enough that violent conflict isn't worth the risk. But these aren't normal times. The drought continues. Food is scarce, and Beta's group has recent experience coordinating collective action. The adult males from Beta's group advance together, just as they did against the hyenas. The same formation, the same coordination. But this time, there's no question of mutual displays and de-escalation. This time, they attack. The violence is brief and brutal. The males from Beta's group don't kill. Australopithecines lack the weapons and probably the intention for lethal intergroup violence at this stage of evolution, but they drive off Omega's females aggressively, biting, hitting, pursuing them into the bush. One female is injured, limping as she retreats. Beta's group has sent a message. This water source is ours. Don't come back. This is the tragedy of cooperation. The same abilities that allow groups to thrive internally make them dangerous externally. The coalition bonds, the costly signaling, the coordinated action, all the beautiful social innovations we've celebrated, they have a shadow side. They enable intergroup violence. And that violence creates selection pressure for even more cooperation, even stronger within-group bonds, even more sophisticated coordination. Because groups that cooperate better in conflicts with other groups are more successful. They maintain access to resources. Their offspring survive at higher rates. This creates what evolutionary biologists call an arms race. Groups compete with other groups, which drives selection for increased cooperation, which makes groups more effective competitors, which intensifies intergroup competition, which drives further selection for cooperation, and so on. The process feeds on itself, accelerating with each generation. The Australopithecines have stumbled into this arms race, and it will drive human evolution forward with terrible efficiency for the next 2 million years. It will give us tribes and nations, warriors and heroes, loyalty and sacrifice, but also war and genocide. The capacity for the most noble acts of self-sacrifice and the most horrific acts of collective violence. Both emerge from the same evolutionary root: parochial altruism, cooperation with insiders, hostility to outsiders. It's the price we paid for becoming human, and the Australopithecines were just beginning to pay it. As night falls and Beta's group settles into their sleeping tree, the males who participated in the attack on Omega's females cluster together. There's a sense of solidarity, of shared accomplishment. They defended their group's interests. They cooperated successfully. They proved their value to the community. The fact that they also inflicted suffering on individuals who were just as hungry, just as desperate, who were simply trying to survive, that doesn't register. Those individuals were outsiders, not part of the in-group, not protected by the moral circle that encompasses group members. The psychology of us versus them was fully engaged, and once engaged, it would never entirely disengage. It would become part of what it means to be human, the capacity for intense cooperation with those we consider our own, combined with the capacity for cruelty toward those we consider other. The revolution that began with females choosing weaker, more cooperative males has led here, to groups of cooperating males coordinating violence against other groups. The line from cooperation to conflict is shorter and more direct than we might wish. But the story isn't over, because intergroup competition will drive one more innovation, one more transformation that will ultimately distinguish humans from all other species on Earth. The arms race of cooperation doesn't just make groups better at fighting, it makes them better at thinking, at communicating, at transmitting knowledge across generations. It makes them cultural. The birth of culture. The drought finally breaks. 3 months after the confrontation at the water source, the rains return. Not the torrential downpours of a good wet season, but enough. The grasslands green, the fig trees fruit, the streams run clear again. Beta's group, weakened by months of scarcity, begins to recover. But something has changed. The group that emerges from the drought isn't quite the same as the group that entered it. They've learned things, not just as individuals, but as a collective, and those learned behaviors are being passed on in ways that will fundamentally alter the trajectory of human evolution. Watch what happens one morning as the group forages near a dried streambed. Epsilon, now a fully integrated coalition member, is digging at the base of a particular type of tree, a species with roots that retain water even during droughts. He learned this technique from Beta during the dry season. Beta learned it from an older female years ago, and now, as Epsilon digs, a juvenile male watches intently from a few meters away. The juvenile is perhaps 4 years old, not yet independent, but no longer an infant. His name, if we were to assign one, might be Kappa. And Kappa is learning something that his genetic inheritance doesn't contain: knowledge about where to find water during drought. Which trees have water-retaining roots? How deep to dig? How to recognize the right species of tree. This is cultural transmission, not genetic, not instinctual, learned. And it's being passed from one generation to the next through observation, imitation, and something that's just beginning to emerge in Australopithecine society: teaching. Teaching is rarer in nature than most people realize. Most animal learning happens through individual trial and error or simple observation. A young chimp watches its mother crack nuts and eventually figures out how to do it through repeated attempts. But the mother doesn't actively teach. She doesn't slow down her movements to make them easier to observe, doesn't demonstrate repeatedly, doesn't correct the youngster's mistakes. But Epsilon does something different. When he notices Kappa watching, he pauses in his digging. He looks at Kappa directly, establishing joint attention, that crucial cognitive ability we discussed earlier. Then he demonstrates again, more slowly this time, exaggerating the movements slightly, scraping away the surface soil, identifying the main root, following it down to where moisture concentrates. Kappa moves closer. He reaches out tentatively with his own hands, trying to mimic Epsilon's movements. His technique is clumsy, inefficient. Epsilon doesn't take over and do it for him. That wouldn't teach anything. But he doesn't ignore the attempt either. He adjusts Kappa's hand position slightly with his own hand. A gentle correction, a physical demonstration of the right technique. This interaction lasts less than 5 minutes. But in those 5 minutes, information is being transmitted in a way that's qualitatively different from simple observation. Epsilon is actively facilitating Kappa's learning. He's investing time and energy in another individual's skill acquisition, even though Kappa is not his offspring. Kappa is actually Alpha's son from a previous mating season. Why would Epsilon do this? What's the evolutionary logic? The answer lies in the dynamics of group competition we explored in the last chapter. Groups where information is efficiently transmitted across generations and across individuals are more successful than groups where each individual must learn everything through costly trial and error. When Beta's group faced Omega's group at the water source, one advantage they had was shared knowledge. Multiple individuals knew about the water-retaining tree roots. Multiple individuals knew which caves provided shelter from the worst heat. Multiple individuals knew which routes through the landscape minimized predator exposure. This shared knowledge is what anthropologists call cumulative culture. Information that accumulates over generations, with each generation adding to and refining what previous generations discovered. And cumulative culture provides enormous adaptive advantages. But cumulative culture requires mechanisms for information transmission. Observation helps, but it's not enough. You need active teaching, imitation, language, memory, and what psychologists call social learning, the preferential learning from skilled individuals over unskilled ones. The Australopithecines were developing all of these mechanisms simultaneously, and that development was driven by the same intergroup competition that drove their cooperation. Over the following weeks, other examples of cultural transmission emerge. Zara is carrying her infant, Beta's daughter, we can assume with reasonable confidence, on her hip as she forages. The infant, about 1 year old, is beginning to show interest in solid foods beyond mother's milk. Zara pauses at a termite mound and uses a stick to extract termites, eating them one by one. The infant watches, reaches out, tries to grab the stick. Zara doesn't give up the stick. She's hungry too. But she doesn't prevent the infant's attempts to learn either. She adjusts her position to make the behavior more visible. She vocalizes softly, a specific pattern that seems to mean pay attention or this is important. This is scaffolded learning. The adult creates conditions that make learning easier for the juvenile without doing the task for them. It's a middle ground between pure observation and direct instruction, and it's surprisingly sophisticated cognitively. Zara has to understand that the infant is trying to learn. She has to model her own behavior for the infant's benefit while still accomplishing her own foraging goals. She has to gauge the infant's skill level and adjust her teaching accordingly. And crucially, she has to be motivated to teach. That motivation comes from maternal investment. Yes, this is her genetic offspring, and teaching increases offspring survival. But it also comes from group-level selection. Groups where adults actively teach juveniles accumulate skills faster than groups where learning is purely observational. Those groups are more successful in intergroup competition. The genes underlying teaching behavior, whatever they are, probably involving patience, attention to others' knowledge states, and pro-social motivation, spread through the population. But the most important cultural transmission happens in the domain we've been exploring throughout this entire story: social behavior itself. Kappa, the 4-year-old juvenile, is watching the adult males constantly. He sees how beta and epsilon coordinate. He observes their coalition behaviors. He notices that beta shares food and that other adults reciprocate that sharing later. He watches how males manage conflicts, approaching cautiously, using submissive gestures, avoiding direct confrontation when possible. Kappa is learning the social rules of Australopithecine society. Not through explicit instruction. No one is explaining to him, "This is how you form a coalition," or "This is how you maintain your reputation." He's learning through observation and imitation of successful individuals. This is called cultural group selection in evolutionary theory. Groups develop different social norms, different patterns of cooperation, different conflict resolution strategies, different mating systems. These norms are transmitted culturally from older to younger generations. Groups with more effective social norms outcompete groups with less effective norms. Over time, the more effective norms spread. And here's the key insight. Once you have cultural transmission, evolution can happen much faster than genetic evolution. Genetic changes take thousands of generations to spread through a population. Cultural changes can spread in a single generation if they're observably beneficial. Beta's group has developed particularly effective coalition coordination strategies. Juveniles in Beta's group are learning these strategies by observing the adults. When those juveniles mature and form their own coalitions, they'll apply what they learned. If those strategies are more effective than the strategies used by Omega's group's juveniles, Beta's group will have a competitive advantage in future intergroup conflicts. That competitive advantage translates into better resource access, which means better offspring survival, which means Beta's group grows while Omega's group shrinks. Eventually, Beta's group might split into two groups, spreading their cultural practices across a larger geographic area. Or individuals from Omega's group might join Beta's group, bringing their genes but adopting Beta's group's cultural practices. Either way, the cultural innovations spread, not because they're genetically encoded, but because they're learned, transmitted, and selected at the group level. This is the crucial transformation that began with the Australopithecines. The emergence of culture as a major evolutionary force. Not just a minor supplement to genetic evolution, but a primary driver of adaptation, diversification, and success. And once culture emerges, it creates new selection pressures on the brain itself. Because individuals who are better at cultural learning, better at observing others, imitating complex behaviors, understanding social rules, teaching their own innovations to others, those individuals are more successful. This creates a feedback loop. Cultural transmission selects for larger brains with enhanced learning abilities. Larger brains enable more sophisticated cultural transmission. More sophisticated culture creates more complex social environments. More complex social environments select for even larger brains. The loop accelerates. We can see this acceleration in the fossil record. Australopithecus afarensis, around 3.2 million years ago, had brain sizes of 400 to 500 cubic centimeters. By 2.5 million years ago, with early Homo, brain sizes had increased to 600 to 700 cc's. By 1.8 million years ago, Homo erectus had brains of 850 to 900 cc's. By 500,000 years ago, archaic Homo sapiens had brains approaching modern size at 1200 to 1400 cc's. That's a tripling of brain size in 3 million years. In evolutionary terms, that's extraordinarily rapid, and it's driven primarily by social and cultural selection pressures, not by environmental challenges or tool use or any single factor. It's driven by the arms race of cooperation, culture, and intergroup competition. The Australopithecines initiated this arms race, and we're still living with the consequences. Let's zoom forward for a moment and see where this is heading. Because the cultural capacity that began with Australopithecines sharing information about water-retaining tree roots will eventually produce spoken language with grammar and syntax, symbolic art, mythology and religion, agriculture and cities, writing and mathematics, science and technology. Everything that makes humans unique traces back to these humble beginnings. Teaching a juvenile how to dig for water, coordinating a coalition defense, maintaining social bonds through proto-linguistic communication. But we're not there yet. The Australopithecines are just at the beginning. Their culture is simple: basic foraging techniques, rudimentary social coordination, primitive communication. Nothing compared to what will come later. But the foundation is being laid. And that foundation has a specific architecture. It's built on cooperation within groups and competition between groups. The two forces work together, driving each other forward. Cooperation enables cultural transmission. You can't teach someone who doesn't trust you enough to pay attention. Competition selects for better cultural transmission. Groups that pass knowledge more efficiently outcompete groups that don't. This is why human culture is simultaneously our greatest glory and our deepest shame. The same cultural transmission that allows us to accumulate knowledge across generations also allows us to transmit prejudices, to define outsiders as less than human, to coordinate violence on scales that would be impossible without cultural evolution. The Australopithecines were beginning to experience both sides of this coin. 6 months after the drought ends, Beta's group encounters Omega's group again, but this time the context is different. There's no resource competition. Food and water are abundant. The meeting happens at a neutral location, a grove of fig trees large enough to support both groups simultaneously. The initial tension is palpable. Memories of the drought time conflicts remain. Alpha displays toward Omega. Males from both groups vocalize aggressively. Females gather their juveniles protectively. But then something unexpected happens. A juvenile from Omega's group, a young female, approaches the fig grove from a different direction and finds herself accidentally in the middle of Beta's group. She freezes, terrified. The adult males from Beta's group could easily harm her. In the logic of pure intergroup competition, they should harm her, reducing a competitor group's reproductive potential. But Beta moves toward the juvenile, slowly, non-threateningly. He vocalizes softly, not threat calls, but something closer to reassurance calls. He gestures with his head toward where Omega's group is positioned. The message seems to be, "Go back to your group. You're not welcome here, but I'm not going to hurt you." The juvenile retreats quickly, rejoining Omega's group, and the tension de-escalates. Both groups feed in the fig grove, maintaining distance from each other, but not engaging in overt hostility. What just happened? Why didn't Beta act more aggressively? The answer is complex, involving both evolved psychology and emerging cultural norms. On the evolved psychology side, Australopithecines, like humans, have what primatologists call variable aggression. Unlike some species where aggression is automatic and context-independent, primate aggression is flexible, modulated by context. During the drought, when resources were scarce and group survival was at stake, aggression toward Omega's group was adaptive. It secured critical resources. But now, with resources abundant, aggression is less adaptive. It carries costs, risk of injury, expenditure of energy, potential escalation to more dangerous conflict, without clear benefits. So Beta's aggression toward outgroup members is context-dependent. He's capable of both hostility and tolerance, depending on circumstances. And he's making what amounts to a cost-benefit calculation, though not consciously. His evolved emotional responses are gauging the situation and producing the appropriate behavioral output. But there's also something cultural happening here. Beta's decision not to harm the juvenile might be influenced by an emerging norm within his group. Don't attack vulnerable, non-threatening individuals unnecessarily. This norm might have arisen because groups that follow it maintain better relationships with neighboring groups during times of resource abundance, which provides advantages through occasional tolerance of each other's presence, reduced conflict injuries, and possibly even rare instances of cooperation against common predators. Cultural norms about when to be aggressive and when to be tolerant are being transmitted within Beta's group. Juveniles observing Beta's behavior learn, "We're hostile to outgroups during resource competition, but tolerant during abundance. We're aggressive toward adults who threaten us, but restrained toward vulnerable juveniles who pose no threat." These are the rules of engagement, and they're being culturally transmitted, just like foraging techniques or coalition strategies. Over the following year, Beta's group and Omega's group continue to encounter each other occasionally. The pattern that emerges is neither pure hostility nor pure friendliness, but something more nuanced: conditional tolerance. When resources are abundant, the groups tolerate each other's presence at neutral locations. When resources are scarce, competition resumes. This creates what anthropologists call intergroup social structure, patterned relationships between groups that persist over time. It's not just random encounters, it's a social landscape where groups know each other, remember past interactions, and adjust their behavior based on that history. And this intergroup social structure creates new opportunities for cultural transmission. During one of the tolerant encounters, a young female from Omega's group, let's call her Lambda, watches Zara extracting termites with a stick. Lambda has seen termite extraction before in her own group, but Zara is using a different technique. She's stripped the leaves from the stick more thoroughly, creating a smoother probe that seems to work more efficiently. Lambda observes intently. Later, when she returns to her own group, she tries Zara's technique. It works better than her group's traditional method. Other individuals in Omega's group notice and begin adopting the innovation. This is cross-group cultural transmission. An innovation in one group spreads to another group through observation during neutral encounters. It's rare. Most cultural transmission happens within groups, but it happens. And it means that beneficial innovations can spread across the entire Australopithecine population, not just within isolated groups. This accelerates cultural evolution even further. Groups aren't just innovating independently. They're occasionally sharing innovations. The best techniques, the most effective strategies, the most useful knowledge. All of this can spread beyond group boundaries when intergroup relationships allow. But there's a limit to this cross-group transmission. Hostile relationships prevent it. During the drought, when Beta's group and Omega's group were in direct competition, no cultural transmission occurred. The groups were too focused on excluding each other, too aggressive, too threatened. This creates an interesting dynamic. Some level of intergroup tolerance, even if conditional and context-dependent, facilitates cultural evolution. But too much tolerance eliminates the between-group competition that drives selection for better cooperation within groups. There's a sweet spot. Enough intergroup competition to maintain strong within-group cooperation, but enough occasional tolerance to allow beneficial cultural innovations to spread across group boundaries. The Australopithecines were finding this sweet spot, and in finding it, they were creating the social ecological conditions for the explosive cultural evolution that would come later with genus Homo. As the sun sets on another day in the Pliocene, Beta's group settles into their sleeping tree. Kappa, the juvenile we met earlier learning to dig for water, now sits near Epsilon. They're grooming each other, reinforcing their emerging social bond. Kappa is practicing the social skills he'll need as an adult male: coalition maintenance, reciprocal altruism, reputation management. He's learning culturally, from Epsilon, from Beta, from observing the entire complex social landscape of his group. And what he's learning will determine his success or failure when he matures. If he learns well, if he masters the cultural knowledge of his group, he'll form effective coalitions, attract mates, successfully raise offspring. If he learns poorly, if he fails to grasp the social rules, he'll be excluded, isolated, reproductively unsuccessful. Culture has become as important as genetics. Not more important, genetics still provides the foundation, the brain capacity for learning, the emotional motivations for social behavior. But culture is now a co-equal force, shaping individual survival and reproduction just as powerfully as genetic inheritance. And this cultural evolution is feeding back into genetic evolution. Individuals who are better cultural learners, who have genetic variants that enhance learning ability, teaching capacity, language comprehension, social cognition, those individuals are more successful. Their genes spread. The population evolves genetically to become better at cultural learning. This is called gene-culture coevolution, and it's perhaps the most important dynamic in human evolution. Genes create capacity for culture. Culture creates selection pressures on genes. Genes evolve to enhance cultural capacity. Enhanced cultural capacity creates more complex culture. More complex culture creates stronger selection on genes. The spiral continues, accelerating. The Australopithecines had entered this spiral, and there was no exit. Once a species becomes dependent on cultural transmission for survival, it can't go back. Culture becomes as essential as genetics, as necessary as food or water. We are the descendants of those first cultural learners. Every word we speak, every skill we master, every idea we share, all of it traces back to Australopithecines teaching juveniles to dig for water, coordinating coalitions to compete with other groups, transmitting social norms from generation to generation. The revolution that began with females choosing cooperative males has led to this. A species defined not just by its genes, but by its culture. A species where what you learn matters as much as what you inherit. A species where cooperation, competition, teaching, and learning are all tangled together in an evolutionary dance that will eventually produce art, science, religion, and everything else we consider uniquely human. The Australopithecines couldn't see where this was leading. They were just trying to survive, to find food and water, to protect their offspring, to coordinate with coalition partners. They had no idea they were building the foundation for humanity. But they were. Every coalition they formed, every juvenile they taught, every cultural norm they transmitted, all of it was laying the groundwork for something unprecedented. They were creating us, and the revolution was just beginning. The grandmother hypothesis. The late afternoon sun casts long shadows across the savanna, and an unusual scene unfolds at the edge of Beta's group. An elderly female, we'll call her Sigma, sits surrounded by 3 juveniles who are not her offspring. She's perhaps 40 years old, ancient by Australopithecine standards. Most individuals don't survive past 30. Her teeth are worn almost to the roots, her movements slower than they once were. By all conventional evolutionary logic, she should be dead or dying, a burden on the group consuming resources without contributing. But she's not a burden. She's teaching. Sigma is showing the juveniles how to process a particular type of seed that's encased in a toxic outer shell. The technique is complex. Crack the shell without crushing the seed inside. Then soak the seed in water for several hours to leach out remaining toxins. It's knowledge she's accumulated over decades, refined through trial and error, some of which nearly killed her in her youth. The juveniles watch intently. One of them is Kappa, now 5 years old. Another is Zara's daughter by Beta, about 3 years old. The third is a juvenile from a different matriline entirely. None of them are Sigma's direct descendants. Her last offspring died 2 years ago, and she's well past reproductive age. Yet here she is, investing time and energy in the next generation. And in this seemingly simple act of teaching, we're witnessing another crucial transformation in human evolution, the emergence of the grandmother. Most primate females remain fertile until they die. Female chimps can reproduce into their 40s if they live that long. Female gorillas follow the same pattern. There's no menopause, no extended post-reproductive lifespan. From an evolutionary perspective, this makes sense. If you can't reproduce anymore, why consume resources that could go to individuals who can? But somewhere in the hominin lineage, this changed. Females began surviving well beyond their reproductive years, and those post-reproductive females weren't evolutionary dead weight. They were contributors whose presence increased the survival of their descendants and even of non-descendants within their social group. This is the grandmother hypothesis, proposed by anthropologist Kristen Hawkes in the 1990s. And while the hypothesis was developed to explain human menopause and longevity, its roots may extend back to the Australopithecines. Sigma represents the beginning of this transformation. She can no longer bear offspring, but she possesses something invaluable: knowledge. Decades of experience about which foods are safe and which are deadly, which water sources persist through drought, which predators hunt at which times, where to find shelter during storms, how to process difficult foods that younger individuals would ignore or mishandle. This knowledge is being transmitted to juveniles who will survive better because of it. And here's the evolutionary trick. Even though these juveniles aren't Sigma's direct offspring, many of them are her genetic relatives. Kappa is her grandson, Alpha's son from a previous mating. Zara's daughter carries some of Sigma's genes through more distant kinship connections that tie together the entire group. When Sigma teaches these juveniles, she's increasing the survival probability of individuals who share her genes. It's indirect genetic investment, but it's still genetic investment. Natural selection can favor the evolution of extended post-reproductive lifespan if that lifespan is spent enhancing the survival of genetic relatives. But there's more to the story than just kin selection. Because Sigma is also teaching juveniles who aren't related to her at all. That third juvenile, the one from a different matriline, there's no evidence of recent genetic connection. Yet Sigma teaches that juvenile just as readily as she teaches her own grandson. Why? The answer brings us back to group selection. Remember, groups compete with other groups. Groups where knowledge is efficiently transmitted across all juveniles, regardless of kinship, will outcompete groups where knowledge transmission is limited to direct kin. Sigma's willingness to teach any juvenile in the group, not just her genetic descendants, increases the overall competence of Beta's group. That increased competence translates into advantages in intergroup competition. And here's the key mechanism. Sigma's own descendants benefit from living in a more competent, more successful group. Her grandson Kappa thrives not just because she teaches him directly, but because he's part of a group where all juveniles receive extensive teaching from elders. That group-level competence improves resource acquisition, predator defense, and competitive success against other groups, all of which increases Kappa's survival probability. So Sigma's genes benefit twice. Once through direct teaching of genetic relatives, and once through the group-level advantages created by broad-scale knowledge transmission. This creates strong selection pressure for extended post-reproductive lifespan and for pro-social teaching behavior by post-reproductive individuals. Let's watch Sigma's teaching session more closely, because it reveals something profound about Australopithecine cognition and culture. She's not just demonstrating the seed processing technique passively. She's actively structuring the learning environment. When Kappa tries to crack a seed and his technique is wrong, he's hitting too hard, crushing the seed inside. Sigma gently takes his hand and guides it to the correct striking angle and force. Physical correction, deliberate instruction. When Zara's daughter successfully cracks a seed but forgets to soak it before eating, Sigma vocalizes sharply, a warning call. Then she demonstrates the soaking process again, exaggerating the movements, ensuring the juvenile is watching. When the juvenile finally completes the process correctly, Sigma makes a different vocalization, something that sounds almost like approval. This is pedagogical teaching, not just tolerating observation, not just demonstrating occasionally, but actively shaping the learner's behavior through feedback, correction, and reinforcement. It requires Sigma to monitor the juvenile's knowledge states, understanding what they know and don't know. It requires her to adjust her teaching based on their progress. It requires patience, sustained attention, and genuine investment in their learning success. And it requires something else. It requires that Sigma herself be motivated to teach by something other than immediate personal benefit. She's not eating while she teaches. She's using time that could be spent foraging. She's expending cognitive energy on monitoring and correcting others' behavior. She's getting nothing immediate in return except the satisfaction of seeing the juveniles learn. That satisfaction, that intrinsic motivation to teach, is itself an evolved trait. Individuals who felt rewarded by successful teaching of juveniles had descendants who survived better because those descendants benefited from group-level knowledge transmission. The genes underlying pro-social teaching motivation spread through the population. But grandmothers contribute more than just teaching. They also provide direct childcare support that transforms the reproductive possibilities for their daughters and other younger females in the group. Watch what happens when Zara needs to forage intensively to prepare for another pregnancy. Her 3-year-old daughter, while weaned, still requires supervision and protection. In a chimp group, Zara would have to keep her daughter close, limiting her foraging efficiency. But in Beta's Australopithecine group, Sigma takes over. Sigma spends hours with Zara's daughter, supervising her play, teaching her foraging techniques, protecting her from minor dangers. This frees Zara to range more widely, to forage more efficiently, to regain the body condition necessary for another successful pregnancy. The result? Zara can have offspring at shorter intervals than would otherwise be possible. Instead of waiting 4 or 5 years between births, the typical chimp interbirth interval, Zara might manage 3 to 4 years. Over a reproductive lifetime, that difference compounds. With grandmother support, Zara might successfully raise 5 offspring instead of 3 or 4. And it's not just Zara who benefits. Sigma provides similar support to other females in the group, particularly those who are her genetic relatives, but also, to some degree, to all females with young offspring. The entire group's reproductive output increases because grandmothers are buffering the childcare burden. This creates a positive feedback loop. Females who have genetic variants that extend lifespan beyond menopause produce more surviving grandchildren because they provide childcare and teaching support. Those grandchildren carry the longevity genes. Over generations, the population evolves toward longer post-reproductive lifespan. The Australopithecines were beginning this evolutionary trajectory. They hadn't reached the extreme human pattern. Modern human females can live 30 or 40 years past menopause, an extraordinary lifespan extension. But they were taking the first steps. Post-reproductive females like Sigma were surviving longer than their ancestors had. And they were surviving because their presence increased their descendants' reproductive success. Grandmothers also play a crucial role in maintaining social cohesion within groups, particularly during times of conflict or stress. A dispute breaks out between 2 adult females over access to a particularly productive foraging patch. The conflict escalates. Vocalizations become louder, displays more aggressive. Both females have infants clinging to them, and the stress is affecting the entire group. Males are becoming agitated. Juveniles are whimpering. The social fabric is fraying. Sigma moves between the 2 females. She doesn't physically intervene or show aggression. Instead, she vocalizes, not threat calls, but something different. A specific pattern that seems to carry a message of calm down, separate, this isn't worth it. She positions herself spatially between the females, creating physical distance. She begins grooming one of the females, redirecting attention away from the conflict. The tension de-escalates. The females separate, moving to different foraging areas. The group settles. Crisis averted. This is conflict mediation, and it's a role that post-reproductive females are particularly suited for. They're no longer competing for mates. That reproductive competition ended with menopause. They're not lactating, so they're less resource-stressed than females with infants. They have decades of social experience, understanding the complex relationship networks within the group. They can mediate conflicts without being suspected of self-serving motives. Their interventions are more likely to be accepted because group members recognize, at some level, that grandmothers are invested in group cohesion rather than individual advantage. This mediation role becomes increasingly important as group sizes grow and social complexity increases. Larger groups mean more potential conflicts, more relationships to manage, more opportunities for coalitions to fracture. Grandmothers provide a stabilizing force, using their social expertise and relatively neutral position to maintain group harmony. But perhaps the most important contribution of grandmothers is something less tangible. They're the repositories of rare but critical knowledge. Sigma remembers the last major drought. It happened when she was young, perhaps 15 years old. She remembers which water sources persisted longest. She remembers which foods remained available when everything else failed. She remembers the strategies that worked and the ones that didn't. For most of the group, that drought is ancient history. Many members weren't even born yet. But when the current drought hit, Sigma's knowledge suddenly became invaluable. She guided the group to water sources that younger members didn't know existed. She identified famine foods that would have been overlooked. Her knowledge, accumulated over decades, grandmothers become living libraries, carrying knowledge about rare but catastrophic events, droughts, floods, disease outbreaks, predator invasions. That knowledge is worthless 95% of the time. But in the 5% of circumstances where it's relevant, it's the difference between survival and death. Natural selection strongly favors extended lifespan when that lifespan preserves rare but critical knowledge. An extended lifespan becomes even more valuable as the knowledge base of the species grows through cumulative culture. The more there is to know, the more valuable it becomes to have individuals who remember things from decades past. Now, let's connect this back to our original story about female mate choice and the rise of cooperation. Because the grandmother hypothesis doesn't operate in isolation, it's intertwined with all the other evolutionary dynamics we've been exploring. Remember that females chose smaller, less aggressive, more cooperative males. Those males invested in offspring, creating the pair bonds that stabilized paternal investment. But paternal investment alone isn't enough to dramatically reduce interbirth intervals. What really allows females to reproduce more frequently is grandmother support combined with paternal investment. Zara receives food from Beta, her pair-bonded partner. But she also receives childcare support from Sigma and other older females. This combination, paternal provisioning plus alloparental childcare, creates the conditions for reduced interbirth intervals that distinguish hominins from other great apes. And reduced interbirth intervals mean faster population growth. Groups that evolved this system, cooperative males, pair bonding, grandmother support, could expand demographically faster than groups that relied only on maternal care. In intergroup competition, demographic success matters enormously. The group that grows faster can split into multiple groups, occupy more territory, outcompete neighboring groups for resources. So all these pieces fit together. Female choice for cooperative males, paternal investment, pair bonding, demographic conditions favoring grandmother contributions, selection for extended post-reproductive lifespan, more effective knowledge transmission, greater group competence, success in intergroup competition, selection for even more cooperation, pair bonding, and grandmother support. It's an integrated system, each piece reinforcing the others, the whole complex feeding back on itself in an accelerating evolutionary spiral. As twilight descends, Sigma climbs slowly into the sleeping tree. Her movements are careful, deliberate. She's no longer the agile youngster who could leap between branches effortlessly. But the group waits for her. Younger individuals position themselves on sturdy branches near where she's climbing, providing support if needed. This is another small but significant behavior: care for the elderly. In most primate groups, individuals who can't keep up are left behind. But Beta's group waits for Sigma. They accommodate her slower pace. They share food with her even though her gathering efficiency has declined. Why? Because she's valuable. Her knowledge is valuable. Her teaching is valuable. Her role in conflict mediation is valuable. The group that preserves its grandmothers preserves its accumulated knowledge and social stability. Groups that abandon their elders lose that knowledge and must rediscover everything through costly trial and error. So caring for elderly, post-reproductive individuals becomes adaptive at the group level. Groups that do it outcompete groups that don't. And individuals within those groups, particularly the genetic descendants of the elderly individuals, but to some extent all group members, benefit from that group-level advantage. Sigma settles onto her sleeping branch, and around her, the group arranges itself for the night. Kappa sleeps nearby. He's learned to value his grandmother's proximity, both for the knowledge she provides and for the subtle social protection her presence offers. Zara and her daughters sleep within sight, maintaining the extended family bonds that structure Australopithecine society. Beta and Epsilon are on a nearby branch, their coalition bond as strong as ever. Alpha sleeps higher up, still somewhat isolated, still dominant, but increasingly marginal to the cooperative core of the group. And in this arrangement, this specific configuration of relationships, roles, and social positions, we can see the architecture of human social evolution. Cooperative coalitions among males, pair bonds between males and females, extended families spanning 3 generations, post-reproductive females providing knowledge, teaching, and childcare. All of it working together, each element reinforcing the others. The Australopithecines weren't humans. They weren't even close, really. Their brains were 1/3 the size of ours. Their language was rudimentary. Their technology was non-existent. They were still more ape than human by any objective measure. But the foundation was in place. The social structures, the cooperative mechanisms, the mate choice patterns, the cultural transmission systems, all the fundamental architecture of human sociality was being built. And grandmothers were a crucial part of that architecture, providing the knowledge continuity and demographic support that allowed cooperative groups to thrive. Sigma won't live much longer. Perhaps another year, perhaps 2 if she's lucky. But her knowledge will survive in the juveniles she taught, Her genes will survive in her grandchildren. Her influence on group social dynamics will persist in the norms and relationships she helped shape. She's a success in evolutionary terms, not because she dominated others, or won competitions, or displayed superior strength. She succeeded by living long enough to pass on knowledge, by teaching generously, by maintaining social bonds across generations. She succeeded by being valuable to her group in ways that transcended her individual physical capabilities. By embodying the principle that cooperation, knowledge sharing, and long-term investment in the next generation are adaptive strategies that can outcompete pure physical dominance. She succeeded by being human, or at least by being the Australopithecine version of human, by exemplifying the traits that would eventually distinguish our lineage from all other species on Earth. The revolution that began with females choosing weaker males has led here. To societies where the elderly are valued, where knowledge is treasured, where teaching is motivated, where care extends across generations. It's a revolution that's still unfolding, because the story isn't over. The Australopithecines are just the beginning. The next 2 million years will see even more dramatic transformations. Bigger brains, true language, stone tools, fire, art, agriculture, civilization. But all of it, every bit of it, rests on this foundation, on the choice made by females in the acacia shadow 3 million years ago, on the coalitions formed by males who valued cooperation over dominance, on the grandmothers who taught and cared and preserved knowledge across decades. This is how we became human, not through conquest or dominance or individual genius, but through cooperation, teaching, patience, and care, through choosing weakness that was actually strength, through valuing intelligence over aggression, through investing in the future instead of maximizing the present. It's a gentler story than the one we usually tell ourselves about evolution. But that doesn't make it less true. And as Sigma closes her eyes for the night, surrounded by the group she's helped to build and sustain, we can honor her contribution to the greatest evolutionary transformation in the history of life. The transformation that made us, the first betrayal. The morning begins like any other. Beta's group descends from their sleeping tree and spreads out to forage in the woodland edge. But something is different today, though it will take hours for anyone to notice. Epsilon is restless. He's been a loyal coalition partner to Beta for 3 years now, sharing food, coordinating in conflicts, supporting each other through droughts and predator encounters. Their bond has been one of the strongest in the group, but bonds, no matter how strong, can break. And what's about to unfold will reveal something darker about the evolution of cooperation, the shadow side of intelligence, the capacity for deception, and the fragility of trust. Epsilon has been watching, learning, calculating. He's noticed that Beta's relationship with Zara has made Beta somewhat complacent. Beta shares food with Zara preferentially, spends time with her offspring, invests heavily in maintaining their pair bond. This investment is adaptive. It's the strategy that's been successful throughout this story, but it creates a vulnerability. While Beta is focused on Zara, he's less vigilant about his coalition partnerships. He takes Epsilon's loyalty for granted, and Epsilon has noticed this. More importantly, Epsilon has been cultivating a secret alliance with Alpha. This seems counterintuitive at first. Alpha is the large, dominant male who represents the old system, dominance through strength rather than cooperation. Epsilon is the smaller, coalition-building male who represents the new system. They should be opposed, fundamentally incompatible. But evolution is more complex than simple narratives suggest. Epsilon has realized something crucial. While cooperation is generally more successful than pure dominance, there are situations where combining cooperation with strategic dominance can be even more successful. If he can form a coalition with Alpha, using Alpha's physical presence as a threat while maintaining his own coalition-building skills, he might be able to outmaneuver Beta entirely. For weeks, Epsilon has been sharing food with Alpha. Small amounts, easy to overlook. He's groomed Alpha occasionally, something no one else in the group bothers to do given Alpha's social isolation. He's supported Alpha in minor conflicts where Beta didn't notice or didn't care. Slowly, subtly, he's built a relationship that exists in the shadows of the group's social network. And now, he's ready to cash in that investment. The opportunity arrives midday. Beta has found a tree heavy with ripe fruits, a valuable resource in a season when most trees have already been depleted. He vocalizes to the group, signaling the find. This is normal behavior, the food-sharing, cooperative pattern that's become standard in Beta's group. Individuals arrive and begin feeding. But Epsilon doesn't approach to feed cooperatively. Instead, he hangs back. And Alpha, responding to a prearranged signal, a specific vocalization pattern that Epsilon taught him in their secret meetings, approaches the tree aggressively. Alpha displays toward Beta, lips pulled back, arms raised. But this time, instead of being alone, he has support. Epsilon positions himself beside Alpha, mirroring his aggressive posture. Beta is shocked, confused. His coalition partner is displaying against him alongside the male who represents everything their coalition was built to oppose. For a moment, Beta freezes, unable to process this violation of everything he understands about social relationships. Gamma, Beta's other coalition partner, moves toward the conflict, ready to support Beta as he's done dozens of times before. But Epsilon vocalizes sharply, a threat call, unmistakable, directed at Gamma. The message is clear: if you intervene, you're next. Gamma hesitates. He looks to Beta, uncertain. The coalition that's been the core of the group's social structure for years is fracturing in real time, and no one knows what to do. This is the cost of intelligence. The same cognitive abilities that enable cooperation, theory of mind, strategic planning, reputation management, also enable deception. Epsilon didn't randomly betray Beta. He planned this. He assessed the social landscape, identified Beta's vulnerabilities, cultivated an alternative alliance, chose his moment carefully. This is what evolutionary biologists call Machiavellian intelligence at its most sophisticated. Not just simple defection or opportunistic cheating, but strategic long-term manipulation of social relationships for personal advantage. And here's the terrible truth: it works, at least in the short term. Beta, without coalition support and faced with both Alpha's size and Epsilon's aggression, backs away from the fruit tree. He submits. His social status, built carefully over years, collapses in minutes. Alpha and Epsilon feed at the tree, and when other group members approach, they're allowed, but only after Alpha and Epsilon have taken their fill. The social order has been overturned. The coalition system that replaced pure dominance hierarchy has itself been betrayed by someone who understood it well enough to manipulate it. Over the following days, the consequences ripple through the group. Beta is socially diminished. He still has his relationship with Zara, but his influence in male coalitions is shattered. When conflicts arise, his support is no longer sought. When food sources are found, he no longer has preferential access. He's become peripheral, marginalized. Epsilon, meanwhile, has elevated his status dramatically. He's now Alpha's primary coalition partner, a position that gives him many of the benefits of Alpha's dominance while maintaining the coalition-building skills that Alpha lacks. He has access to resources, influence over group movements, and increased attention from females. But something unexpected is also happening. The group's social atmosphere has changed. There's tension now, wariness. If Epsilon could betray Beta after years of apparent loyalty, who else might betray whom? The trust that underlay the cooperative system is damaged. Gamma is uncertain about his position. Should he try to form a new coalition with Beta? With Epsilon and Alpha? With other males? The social calculations have become more complex, more treacherous. Females are recalculating their mate choice decisions. Zara remains bonded to Beta. Their relationship is too established to dissolve immediately. But other females begin paying more attention to Epsilon. He's demonstrated something that, from a certain evolutionary perspective, is impressive: the intelligence to navigate complex social dynamics and improve his position dramatically. And younger males, particularly Kappa, are watching and learning. They're observing that betrayal can be successful, at least sometimes. That loyalty isn't always the winning strategy. That Machiavellian intelligence can outcompete simple cooperation. The cultural transmission system we celebrated earlier is now transmitting something darker: the knowledge of how to manipulate, how to deceive, how to betray. But evolution has responses to betrayal. The same intelligence that enables deception also enables its detection. And groups have mechanisms, imperfect but real, for dealing with betrayers.
Sigma, the grandmother, has been watching the social upheaval with her decades of accumulated wisdom. She understands what Epsilon did, even if she couldn't have articulated it in human terms. And she begins to respond. She stops teaching Epsilon's offspring, a young juvenile who had been benefiting from her instruction. It's a subtle punishment, easy to miss, but consequential. That juvenile will learn less efficiently, acquire knowledge more slowly, be at a disadvantage compared to juveniles who continue receiving elder instruction. Other older females follow Sigma's lead, not through coordinated decision, but through independent responses to Epsilon's betrayal. They withdraw cooperation from him and his close associates. They share food less frequently with him. They provide less childcare support for his potential offspring. This is distributed punishment. No single individual is attacking Epsilon or openly challenging him. But the cooperative network that sustained the group is partially withdrawing from him. And that withdrawal has costs. Meanwhile, something surprising happens with Beta. He's been socially diminished, yes, but he doesn't collapse entirely. Instead, he begins rebuilding his coalition network from a different angle. He reaches out to younger males who are on the periphery of the social hierarchy. Males like Kappa, who are approaching adulthood but don't yet have established coalition partnerships. Beta shares food with these younger males. He teaches them. He supports them in minor conflicts. He's doing what he's always done, building cooperative relationships through consistent pro-social behavior. But now he's doing it with individuals who have less to lose, who are hungry for alliance opportunities. Over weeks and months, a counter-coalition begins to form. It's not as powerful as the Alpha-Epsilon alliance initially, But it has something the Alpha-Epsilon alliance lacks. It's based on genuine reciprocity rather than strategic manipulation. The critical test comes 6 months after the betrayal. The group encounters Omega's community again, this time in a context of resource competition. A water source, scarce again as the dry season intensifies, is being contested. Both groups need it desperately. Alpha and Epsilon move to confront Omega's group, expecting the rest of Beta's group to support them as a unified force. But something has changed. The coalition males who would normally follow Alpha and Epsilon's lead hesitate. Beta's rebuilt coalition, smaller, younger, but cohesive, doesn't move forward. The message is subtle but clear. We're not supporting you unconditionally anymore. Your betrayal broke the social contract. Now you need to earn our support, not assume it. Alpha and Epsilon find themselves facing Omega's group without the full backing of their own community. The confrontation becomes more uncertain, more dangerous. They're forced to retreat, to yield the water source. Beta's group loses the conflict, but the loss exposes the weakness of the Alpha-Epsilon alliance. Later, when the group settles for the night, tensions are high. Alpha displays aggressively towards several males, trying to reassert dominance. But he's ineffective without coalition support. His displays are met with passive resistance, no direct challenges, but no submission either. He's powerful, but isolated, just as he was before forming the alliance with Epsilon. And Epsilon finds himself in a precarious position. He successfully betrayed Beta and elevated his status, yes, but he's now associated with an alliance that failed the group in intergroup competition. His reputation is damaged in ways that might take years to repair. This entire sequence reveals something crucial about the evolution of cooperation. It's not a simple linear progression from competition to cooperation. It's a complex dynamic equilibrium where cooperation, defection, punishment, reputation, and strategic calculation all interact continuously. Cooperation is stable not because betrayal is impossible, but because betrayal usually carries long-term costs that exceed short-term benefits. Epsilon's betrayal succeeded tactically, but failed strategically. He gained immediate benefits, but damaged his position in the broader social network. And the group responded not through formal punishment or coordinated revenge, but through distributed withdrawal of cooperation. This is a more robust response mechanism than centralized punishment, because it doesn't require coordination or leadership. Each individual, acting in their own interest, reduces cooperation with betrayers. The cumulative effect is isolation. But here's the nuance. Epsilon isn't completely expelled. He's not killed or driven from the group. He remains a member, still has relationships, still participates in group activities. The punishment is calibrated, proportional. He lost social capital, but retained membership. And that means he has the opportunity to rebuild trust over time if he demonstrates consistent cooperative behavior. This proportional, calibrated response system is more sophisticated than simple binary options of full inclusion or total exclusion. It allows for redemption. It recognizes that individuals make mistakes or miscalculations. It maintains group cohesion even when dealing with violations of cooperative norms. 2 years after the betrayal, the social landscape has shifted again. Alpha is aging, slowing down, his dominance waning as physical prowess declines. Epsilon has partially rebuilt his reputation through consistent food sharing and coalition support, though his relationships still carry the mark of past betrayal. Beta has re-established himself as a central coalition figure, though more cautiously now, more attentive to potential manipulation. And Kappa, now 7 years old and approaching full adulthood, has learned something complex from observing all of this. He's learned that cooperation is generally successful, but that intelligence allows for manipulation. He's learned that betrayal can work in the short term, but carries long-term costs. He's learned that reputation matters immensely, and that rebuilding damaged reputation requires sustained effort. He's learned, in other words, to navigate the full complexity of Australopithecine social life. Not just the simple cooperate always strategy, but the more nuanced cooperate most of the time, defect rarely and strategically. Always monitor others' reputations. Always protect your own reputation. Forgive when strategically advantageous. Punish when necessary. This is the real evolutionary game being played. Not simple cooperation versus defection, but a multi-level strategic interaction where every individual is simultaneously cooperating, competing, monitoring, calculating, and adjusting their behavior based on others' responses. And the cognitive demands of this game are immense. You need to track dozens of relationships, remember hundreds of past interactions, predict future behaviors based on observed patterns, manage your own reputation actively, detect deception, sometimes deceive, sometimes forgive, sometimes punish. Always calculate costs and benefits across multiple time horizons. This is what's driving brain expansion in the Australopithecines. Not tool use, not language alone, not environmental challenges. The primary driver is social complexity. The Machiavellian intelligence required to navigate a cooperative system that's constantly vulnerable to exploitation, but robust enough to persist across generations. As another evening falls, Beta's group settles into their sleeping tree. The social order is different than it was 2 years ago, but it's stable again. New equilibria have been found. Trust has been partially rebuilt, or at least working relationships have been reestablished. Epsilon sleeps near Alpha still, but their alliance is less intense, less central to the group structure. Beta sleeps near his rebuilt coalition of younger males, a different kind of alliance now, more egalitarian perhaps, certainly more cautious. Zara remains bonded to Beta, their relationship surviving the social upheaval. Her latest infant clings to her chest, Beta's offspring with high probability, the result of their sustained pair bond. Sigma sleeps nearby, still contributing knowledge and teaching despite her advancing age, still valuable despite no longer reproducing. The group has weathered a crisis. Social bonds were broken and partially rebuilt. Trust was damaged and partially restored. The cooperative system proved fragile but not brittle, capable of bending under stress without completely shattering. And this resilience is itself an evolved trait. Groups whose cooperative systems could survive occasional betrayals outcompeted groups whose systems collapsed at the first defection. The Australopithecines were evolving not just cooperation, but robust cooperation. Systems that could absorb shocks, heal from betrayals, maintain cohesion even when individuals occasionally defected. This robustness would become essential as brain size increased and cognitive abilities expanded. Because smarter individuals are better at both cooperation and manipulation. As intelligence increases, so does the potential for sophisticated betrayal. The only way cooperation can persist in highly intelligent species is if the systems become robust enough to detect, punish, and recover from betrayal. Humans inherited this robustness from our Australopithecine ancestors. Our cooperation is messy, often violated, constantly tested. But it persists because the underlying mechanisms are robust. We gossip to spread reputation information. We feel moral outrage to motivate punishment. We practice forgiveness to allow redemption. We form coalitions to balance power. All of these mechanisms trace back to the Australopithecines learning to maintain cooperation in the face of individuals smart enough to betray it. Epsilon's betrayal of Beta wasn't an aberration. It was a preview of the eternal tension in human social life between cooperation and exploitation, trust and manipulation, loyalty and self-interest. The fact that Beta's group survived that tension, adapted to it, and continued functioning is the real story. Not that cooperation is perfect or that betrayal is impossible, but that cooperation can be stable even when betrayal is possible. That intelligence creates both the capacity for deception and the capacity to manage deception. That social systems can be robust enough to persist across generations, even though they're constantly being tested by individuals trying to gain advantage. This is the final piece of the puzzle. Female choice for cooperative males created the foundation. Coalition formation among males built the structure. Cultural transmission strengthened and spread the innovations. Grandmothers provided continuity and knowledge. And now, the capacity to survive betrayal, to detect it, punish it, recover from it, and maintain cooperation despite it, completed the system. The Australopithecines had created a new kind of social animal, one that cooperated extensively but not naively, one that trusted conditionally rather than absolutely, one that monitored constantly, calculated endlessly, cooperated strategically, one that was becoming human. The revolution that began with females choosing weaker males had led through cooperation, culture, and complexity to this: a species whose greatest strength and deepest curse was the intricate, fragile, resilient web of social relationships that bound them together. They couldn't survive alone, but they couldn't fully trust together. So they learned to navigate the space between, balancing cooperation and caution, trust and vigilance, loyalty and self-interest. They learned to be social. They learned to be strategic. They learned to be, in the deepest sense, political animals whose survival depended on mastering the art of relationships. And in mastering that art, they set the stage for everything that would follow. For tribes and nations, for friends and enemies, for love and betrayal, for all the beauty and ugliness of human social life, it all started here, in a sleeping tree in the Pliocene, with a group of apes who were slowly, painfully, brilliantly learning what it meant to live together, learning what it meant to be us. The children who changed everything. Morning light filters through the acacia canopy, and Zara's 3-year-old daughter is doing something remarkable. She's playing. Not just moving randomly or practicing motor skills, but engaged in what appears to be genuine pretend play. She's picked up a stick and is carrying it against her chest the way her mother carries infants. She's vocalizing softly to the stick, the same comforting sounds Zara makes to actual infants. She's even adjusting her posture to support the imaginary weight. This might seem trivial, even cute, but what's happening in this juvenile's brain
represents one of the most important cognitive revolutions in human evolution: the emergence of childhood as a distinct life stage, and with it, the capacity for imagination, play, and extended learning that would ultimately separate humans from every other species on Earth. The Australopithecines were inventing childhood, and in doing so, they were creating the cognitive foundations for everything from language to art to science. In most mammal species, there's infancy and then there's adulthood. The transition is relatively quick. A young chimp depends entirely on its mother for about 5 years, then relatively rapidly transitions to independence. By age 8 or 9, a chimp is essentially a small adult, capable of finding food independently, navigating the social hierarchy, understanding the basics of survival. But something different was happening with the Australopithecines. The transition from infancy to adulthood was stretching out, creating an extended period of dependence that anthropologists call childhood. The years between weaning and reproductive maturity, when juveniles are physically capable of surviving independently, but remain in a state of learning, play, and social development. Why was this happening? The answer lies in the complexity we've been documenting throughout this story. Australopithecine social life, with its coalitions and reputation management, and cultural transmission and Machiavellian politics, was becoming too complex to master quickly. Juveniles needed more time to learn, more time to practice social skills through play, more time to absorb the accumulated cultural knowledge of their group. And that extended childhood created selection pressure for neurological changes that would have profound consequences. Zara's daughter, we'll call her Ro, isn't alone in her pretend play. 2 other juveniles, including Kappa's younger half-brother, are nearby. They're engaged in what looks like play fighting, but with an interesting twist. They're taking turns. One juvenile assumes an aggressive posture, displays briefly, then subsides. The other responds in kind. Then they switch roles. This is role-playing. They're practicing social behaviors in a safe context, learning the signals and responses that will be crucial in actual conflicts later. But they're doing more than just rehearsing fixed behaviors. They're experimenting with variations, testing different strategies, observing what happens when they modify standard patterns. They're learning creatively. And creative learning requires a specific type of brain development. In most primates, the brain grows rapidly during infancy and then stabilizes relatively quickly. By the time a chimp is 5 or 6 years old, its brain has reached about 90% of adult size. But in the Australopithecines, brain growth was beginning to extend further into childhood. Ro's brain at age 3 is still growing, still developing, still forming new neural connections at a rate that would have slowed down in her ancestors. This extended brain development period, what neuroscientists call extended neural plasticity, creates a window of opportunity. The brain remains flexible, adaptable, capable of forming new connections and learning new patterns. This flexibility is costly. A developing brain is vulnerable, and extended childhood means extended dependence on adults. But it's also incredibly valuable in a world where what you need to learn is complex and constantly changing. Ro's extended childhood, supported by her mother and grandmother and the broader group, is allowing her brain to wire itself to the specific social and ecological demands of her environment. She's not just inheriting a fixed set of instincts. She's developing a customized cognitive architecture optimized for the particular challenges of her group, her time, her world.
But extended childhood creates a problem. How do you keep juveniles alive and learning during the years when they're physically capable of independence, but cognitively still developing? This is where all the pieces we've discussed start working together in a new way. Grandmothers like Sigma provide supervision and teaching, freeing mothers like Zara to forage more efficiently. Fathers like Beta provide food and protection, making it possible for juveniles to spend time playing and learning instead of constantly foraging for survival. Coalition networks among males create a safer environment where predation risk is reduced, allowing juveniles to take the risks inherent in exploration and play. The entire social system is being reorganized around the needs of learning juveniles. And that reorganization is creating selection pressure for cognitive abilities that support extended childhood. Adults need patience to tolerate energetic, curious juveniles who slow down foraging efficiency and create noise that might attract predators. Adults need teaching motivation to invest time in juvenile learning rather than just letting them figure everything out independently. Adults need the cognitive ability to recognize that today's investment in juvenile learning will pay off years later when those juveniles mature into competent adults. All of this requires delayed gratification, long-term thinking, and pro-social motivation that extends beyond immediate genetic offspring to encompass the entire next generation of the group. These cognitive and motivational traits are being selected intensely because groups that successfully raise curious, playful, learning-oriented juveniles develop more capable adults. Those adults form better coalitions, discover more efficient foraging techniques, navigate social complexity more successfully, and outcompete neighboring groups. Watch what happens when Ro tries something new. She's observed adults using rocks to crack open hard seeds, but the technique is difficult and she hasn't mastered it yet. She picks up a rock, positions a seed on a flat surface, and strikes. The rock glances off, missing the seed entirely. She tries again, misses. Again, misses. In a typical primate learning scenario, she might give up after a few failed attempts. The energetic cost of continued failure outweighs the potential benefit. But Ro persists. She tries different striking angles, different rock sizes, different amounts of force. She's not just mechanically repeating the same failed attempt. She's experimenting, varying her approach, gathering information about what works and what doesn't. This persistence in the face of failure, this exploratory drive, is characteristic of extended childhood. Juveniles with long developmental periods can afford to spend time and energy on experimentation that doesn't yield immediate rewards. The costs of learning failure are buffered by adult support, so juveniles can take risks that independent foragers couldn't afford. After about 20 attempts, Ro succeeds. The rock strikes true, the seed cracks, and she extracts the edible interior. The reward is small, one seed, but the learning is enormous. She's acquired a technique that will serve her for the rest of her life. And she acquired it through a process of active experimentation that would have been impossible without the extended, protected childhood that her group's social system provides. But here's what's most significant. Kappa's younger half-brother has been watching Ro's entire experimental process. He observed her failures, her adjustments, her eventual success. And now he tries the technique himself, but incorporating what he learned from watching her mistakes. His learning curve is faster because he benefited from observing her exploration. This is what developmental psychologists call social learning or observational learning. the ability to learn from watching others, particularly from watching their failures and successes. It's an incredibly efficient learning mechanism, essentially allowing individuals to download years of trial and error experience in minutes of observation. But it requires specific cognitive abilities, sustained attention, the ability to map observed actions onto your own motor systems, memory to retain observed techniques, and the understanding that others' actions are informative for your own behavior. All of these abilities are being enhanced through the extended childhood period when the brain remains plastic and learning-focused. Childhood also creates opportunities for a cognitive ability that will become central to human uniqueness: imagination. Ro isn't just carrying a stick as if it's an infant. She's pretending. She's engaging in counterfactual thinking. This stick isn't actually an infant, but I'm going to act as if it is. She's mentally representing something that doesn't exist in the immediate sensory environment and responding to that representation rather than to reality. This is the foundation of symbolic thought. The ability to let one thing stand for another thing, to manipulate representations mentally without being constrained by immediate reality. It's the cognitive capacity that will eventually enable language, where sounds represent objects and concepts, that will enable art, where marks on surfaces represent animals or events, that will enable mathematics, technology, religion, and every other uniquely human cultural domain. And it's emerging through play during extended childhood. Developmental psychologists have shown that pretend play correlates with the development of theory of mind, the ability to understand that others have mental states different from your own. When Ro pretends the stick is an infant, she's demonstrating that she can maintain two representations simultaneously: the stick as stick, reality, and the stick as infant, pretense. This same cognitive ability allows her to understand that what she knows might be different from what another individual knows, that what she wants might be different from what another individual wants. Theory of mind is absolutely essential for the complex social cooperation we've been documenting. You can't form effective coalitions without understanding your partner's goals and motivations. You can't maintain reputation without understanding how others perceive you. You can't teach effectively without understanding what the learner knows and doesn't know. You can't deceive without understanding what others believe. All of these advanced social cognitive abilities are being scaffolded during childhood through play. Through pretend scenarios where juveniles practice taking different perspectives, imagining counterfactual situations, manipulating representations mentally. The Australopithecine juveniles playing in the shade of the acacia tree aren't just passing time. They're building the cognitive architecture that will support the most complex social systems ever evolved on Earth. But extended childhood has another consequence that's easy to overlook. It strengthens social bonds across generations and across non-kin relationships in unprecedented ways. Ro isn't just being cared for by her mother. She's receiving attention, teaching, and protection from her grandmother, Sigma, from her father, Beta, from Beta's coalition partners, from older juveniles, and even occasionally from unrelated adults. She's embedded in a web of relationships that span age groups and kinship categories. This creates what anthropologists call alloparenting, care provided by individuals other than the biological parents. And alloparenting, when it's extensive and systematic, as it's becoming in Australopithecine groups, transforms social structure. Beta isn't just investing in Rho because she's his genetic offspring, though that's certainly part of it. He's investing because Rho is part of his social group, because caring for juveniles is what males do to maintain coalition partnerships and attract mates. Because the entire group's success depends on successfully raising the next generation. Sigma teaches Rho even though Rho isn't her direct descendant. She teaches because that's what grandmothers do, because juvenile learning increases group competence, because the cultural knowledge she carries is valuable only if it's transmitted. Epsilon, despite his past betrayal and current marginal status, occasionally shares food with Rho and other juveniles. Not extensively, not as generously as Beta, but enough to signal, I'm not completely outside the cooperative network. I still contribute to the group's collective offspring. Even Omega's group, when occasionally encountering Beta's group in neutral contexts, sometimes tolerates juveniles from Beta's group feeding in the same trees, learning the same foraging techniques. There's a recognition, implicit and limited but real, that juveniles occupy a special category, not quite full competitors, not yet subject to the full force of intergroup hostility. This special status of juveniles, this partial protection from adult competition and conflict, creates a developmental niche, a protected space where learning can occur with reduced immediate survival pressure. And that niche is being actively maintained by adult investment, vigilance, and tolerance. The emergence of this developmental niche is one of the most important innovations in human evolution. It's what allowed our ancestors to become lifelong learners, to develop the cognitive flexibility that's our species' signature trait, to accumulate knowledge across generations and transmit it efficiently to the next generation. As afternoon heat intensifies, the group moves to shade near a water source. The juveniles remain energetic, continuing their play even as adults rest. Rho and 3 other juveniles are now engaged in what looks like a chase game. One juvenile runs, the others follow, roles switch, patterns vary. But embedded in the play are elements that matter profoundly for their future. They're learning to read each other's body language, to anticipate movements, to coordinate actions. They're practicing the rapid social signaling and response that will be essential in coalition coordination, in predator evasion, in intergroup conflicts. They're building physical skills, running, turning, climbing, but also social skills, turn-taking, attention to others' states, calibration of force and aggression to keep play from escalating to real fighting. And they're doing all this in a relatively safe context, with adults nearby to intervene if play gets too rough or if danger appears. The adults tolerate the noise and disruption of juvenile play because somewhere in their evolved psychology, there's a recognition that this play serves a purpose. That energetic, playful juveniles become competent adults. That groups that successfully raise exploratory, social, learning-focused young are more successful in the long run. Kappa, now 8 years old and transitioning from childhood to adolescence, watches the younger juveniles with a mixture of nostalgia and emerging adult perspective. He was one of those playful children not long ago. Now he's beginning to take on adult responsibilities, participating in foraging parties, paying attention to coalition dynamics, learning the more serious aspects of social navigation. But he still plays occasionally, particularly with younger juveniles. And in that continued play, he's doing something important. He's serving as a bridge between generations, helping to socialize the next cohort,
transmitting social norms and behavioral patterns he learned from older individuals when he was younger. This multi-generational transmission creates stability in cultural patterns. Social norms don't just pass from parents to offspring. They pass through multiple channels, from grandparents to grandchildren, from older siblings and cousins to younger ones, from unrelated but friendly adults to all juveniles in the group.
The redundancy of transmission routes makes cultural knowledge more stable, harder to lose, more likely to accumulate across generations. But there's a darker element to extended childhood that we need to acknowledge: vulnerability. Juveniles who remain dependent for longer are vulnerable for longer. Predators, disease, accidents, and intergroup violence all pose threats to juveniles who haven't yet reached full physical maturity and independence. The fossil record tells us this story plainly. Juvenile Australopithecine remains are found more frequently than adult remains in predator accumulation sites. Young individuals were preferentially targeted by leopards, saber-toothed cats, and other predators because they were easier prey, smaller, slower, less experienced in predator evasion. This created intense selection pressure for adult protective behaviors. Groups that successfully protected their juveniles through vigilance, coalition defense, and strategic habitat use had more juveniles survive to reproductive age. Those juveniles carried the genes and learned the behaviors that made their group's protective strategies successful. Over generations, Australopithecine groups became increasingly focused on juvenile protection. Adults position themselves spatially between juveniles and likely predator approach routes. They responded to juvenile distress calls with intense urgency. They coordinated group movements to keep juveniles in the safest positions. They shared information about predator locations and threats through increasingly sophisticated vocalizations. All of this represents cognitive and emotional investment in the collective offspring of the group. And that investment was both cause and consequence of extended childhood. Extended childhood required protective investment to be viable, and protective investment created conditions where extended childhood could evolve further, where juveniles could afford to spend even more time learning and playing, because adult vigilance reduced the immediate survival costs. This is another feedback loop in the complex system of human evolution. Social cooperation enables extended childhood. Extended childhood enables more complex learning. Complex learning enhances adult cognitive abilities. Enhanced cognitive abilities improve cooperation. Improved cooperation enables even more extended childhood. Each element reinforces the others in an accelerating spiral. As evening approaches and shadows lengthen across the savanna, Zara calls to Ro with a specific vocalization pattern. It's time to move toward the sleeping tree, time to transition from play to rest. Ro responds immediately, having learned this pattern through months of consistent reinforcement. She moves toward her mother, takes her position in the traveling formation, juveniles in the center, adults on the periphery, and the group begins its evening migration. Ro is tired but content. She spent the day playing, learning, being cared for by multiple adults, experimenting with new skills, socializing with other juveniles. She's been a child, in the truest sense, dependent but curious, protected but exploratory, learning through play rather than just surviving through instinct. In another species, a 3-year-old would be much more independent, much closer to adult functionality. But Ro has years of childhood ahead of her still, years of learning and play and social development before she'll be expected to function as a fully independent adult, before she'll be ready to navigate the immense social complexity
that defines Australopithecine existence.
And in those years, her brain will continue to develop, to wire itself to the demands of her environment, to build the cognitive architecture that will allow her to eventually become a fully functioning member of this incredibly complex social species. She's being shaped, slowly and carefully, into something remarkable. Not through genetic programming alone, but through the interaction of genes, environment, culture, and the extended developmental window that her species has created. The Australopithecines didn't know they were inventing childhood. They didn't plan it, didn't consciously choose it. It emerged from the complex interaction of female mate choice, coalition cooperation, grandmother support, cultural transmission, and intergroup competition. Each element created conditions that favored slightly longer developmental periods, slightly more extended parental investment, slightly greater cognitive flexibility. Over hundreds of thousands of years, those slight extensions accumulated. Childhood lengthened. Brains grew. Learning became more central to development. And a new kind of creature emerged. One that remained a child for years, that learned extensively from others, that played and imagined and experimented, that developed slowly but emerged as an adult with cognitive abilities far surpassing anything its genetic inheritance alone could provide. The revolution that began with females choosing weaker males had led here, to children playing in the shade of acacia trees, imagining, experimenting, learning in ways that no other species had ever managed, to children who were becoming human. And in their play, in their extended dependence, in their remarkable cognitive flexibility, we can see the seeds of everything that would come after. Language and art and technology and science, culture and civilization, and all the glorious and terrible things humans would eventually create. It all started with children who had time to learn, adults who were willing to teach, and a social system complex enough to protect and nurture the slow, expensive, miraculous process of human development. The children were changing everything. They just didn't know it yet.